Chapter 746. The power in Black Sand's body was in disarray. The arm holding the sword was weak and he had no choice but to switch to another hand. Just as he got up, the giant beetle was already in front of him. It raised its two front limbs and did not give Black Sand any time to breathe. Xia felt his scalp go numb from the pressure brought about by the large beetle. Every muscle in his body was trembling, and there was no time for him to dodge. He could only raise his arm and place his sword horizontally in front of him, blocking the attack that was already in front of him. Bang! Black Sand was almost completely smashed into the sand. He could not hold his sword steadily. If it was not for the fact that his body was much stronger, anyone else would have been smashed to death. Even so, Black Sand was barely holding on. He did not even have time to breathe. Xia smelled the scent of death. Previously, he thought that after breaking free from his shackles, he would no longer have such a feeling. But now, he felt it. Fear flashed through his scarlet eyes that were oozing blood. He did not want to die. He still wanted to unify this scattered land of desert bandits. He even fantasized about one day taking over Rock Hill City's territory and controlling the entire desert. But now, he could only helplessly endure the fierce and murderous smashes again and again. Sapphire's attack was actually very simple. In the beginning, it did not know the strength of Black Sand's weapon and tested it a few times. But once it confirmed Black Sand and the sword's capabilities, its attack method was very clear. Especially now, when Black Sand was weak, Sapphire did not slack off and did not hold back. There were no superfluous movements. It was simple and straightforward. It smashed again and again. After smashing into the sand, Sapphire would pull him up from the sand and smash him again. If one smash did not kill him, Sapphire would smash him a few more times. Just like when Sapphire was chasing after those sand lizards, Sapphire would fish you out first before hitting you again. Unless you were really nailed to death, Sapphire would not relax. This was because many times, when Sapphire thought that the prey did not have the strength to stand up and was about to turn it into a ball, it would realize that the prey had escaped. In order to avoid such mistakes, Sapphire's two front limbs did not stop. Rumbling sounds came from the sand. Sand flowers bloomed and fell. Potholes appeared and were flattened. When Black Sand heard the sound of his bones breaking, his consciousness gradually blurred. He could no longer feel the pain in his body. He regretted his decision. He should not have forced the blue beetles into a corner. Otherwise, the blue beetles would not have summoned the giant beetle. Or perhaps, he should have fled the moment the giant beetle appeared. Even if he lost his territory and his subordinates, with his ability and the sword in his hand, he could quickly rebuild a new group of desert bandits in the desert. Even before his death, Black Sand believed that the giant blue beetle was summoned by Yiken. Sapphire finally stopped its attack. Its shovel-like head twitched as if it was thinking of what to do with this person. Its two paddle-shaped antennae moved. It wanted to wrap the prey into a ball, but the prey was too small. It would only be a small ball even if it was wrapped into a ball. While Sapphire was hesitating, Xiaofan gave it a command. In the end, Sapphire did not manage to turn the Black Sand into a ball. It extended its forelimbs to scoop up the object that had been smashed into the sand and left. After Sapphire left, a swarm of black beetles crawled out from the sand and swarmed towards the unrecognizable person. Xia had eaten many people before. Even his blood relatives were not spared when he was still on the run. Men, women, the elderly, and children, he had eaten them all. However, he had never thought that he would be eaten by a group of insects one day. The Viper Man who was huddled in a low sand house saw the situation through the gap of the half-blocked vent. He shrunk into a corner of the house. He did not dare to go out. Even Black Sand had been eaten by the insects. He would not be able to escape their jaws. At this moment, there were more than 300 people surrounding Yiken. Those at the edge were too far away from Yiken and were bitten from time to time. However, they did not dare to attack the beetles. For one, they were afraid of being bitten harder. For another, they were worried that the blue beetles would kick them to the side to fend for themselves. The blue beetles had always swallowed their pride when they were bitten. There were even some who were fighting for a spot closer to the center. Yiken never knew that he was so popular. Even his own subordinates used to be afraid of him due to his strength. Now, their fear was mixed with respect. He knew what these people were thinking, but he really did not summon the giant beetle, nor did he do anything else. It's retreating. The insect swarm is retreating. Someone shouted from the periphery. It's retreating, it's really retreating. More people were ecstatic. The Viper Man's first thought was their leader, Black Sand. Since the insect swarm had retreated, what happened to Black Sand? Did he win or lose the battle with the giant beetle? The black beetles that were lingering nearby either burrowed into the sand or left immediately. Earlier, there was a sea of darkness, but now, there was only sand left. There were also some collapsed sand houses nearby and some gnawed skeletons. Some of the Viper Man took 2 tentative steps outside but did not encounter any more black beetles. Leader. The insect swarm has retreated. Does that mean the giant beetle has left too? A blue beetle asked Yiken. Yiken pushed through the crowd in front of him and walked out. The others followed closely behind Yiken. Although they did not see the beetles, they were still worried. It was safest to stay by Yiken's side. Yiken paused and continued forward. He jumped onto the roof and peered into the distance. No, it's not. It's still here. Just as Yiken's words fell, the people who had walked far away retreated back. They refused to leave even after being threatened with knives by the blue beetles. The insect swarm hasn't retreated. It's just left and stopped nearby. It seems to be waiting for something. Yiken jumped off the roof and said. The little beetles didn't leave. In other words, the giant blue beetle was still there. The giant blue beetle had left after Black Sand. Now that the sounds of fighting could no longer be heard, did Black Sand run away or was he killed by the giant blue beetle? No matter which of the 2 possibilities it was good news for Yiken. He grew increasingly nervous. His Adam's apple bobbed and sweat mixed with sand slid down his back. His eyes were fixed on his surroundings while his ears listened carefully to the surrounding sounds. Rustle, 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 something seemed to be approaching. It came from beneath his feet. The surroundings were silent. Everyone's hearts were trembling. The sound was getting closer. It seemed like the other party had no intention of hiding its tracks. On the sand, a blue carapace peeked out. Everyone held their breaths. Some wanted to run, but after what happened earlier, they hesitated when they lifted their feet. After a moment of struggle, they retracted their feet. Their bodies began to tremble. The giant blue beetle that appeared before Yiken had no other obvious wounds other than scratches on its carapace. It looked fine. However, the thing it was biting on attracted everyone's attention. It was a sword, the one Black Sand used to hold. If the sword was here, did that mean Black Sand was dead? Everyone had their own guesses, but they had to admit that those who stayed here were relieved. The blue beetles felt that Black Sand was no longer a threat. The Vipers, on the other hand, believed that Black Sand would be no match for Yiken without the sword. Hence, their betrayal didn't need to be wary of Black Sand. Not knowing why the giant beetle appeared here again, Yiken didn't dare to move. He stood there stiffly. He wasn't the one who summoned the beetle. He wasn't sure if the giant beetle would attack him after killing Black Sand. The giant blue beetle bit on the sword and moved towards Yiken. The people gathered around Yiken quickly retreated. Some of the blue beetles stood in front of Yiken. Yiken patted them and gestured for them to move aside, leaving Yiken to face the approaching giant beetle alone. Yiken felt the pressure of facing such a creature alone, but he had no choice but to stand here. He watched the approaching giant beetle and thought of a possibility. His gaze was fixed on the sword in the giant beetle's mouth. His heartbeat quickened uncontrollably and his palms were sweating. The giant beetle bit on the sword and approached Yiken. It leaned in as if trying to discern something. Its paddle-like antennae twitched, giving Yiken the illusion that he would be flattened in the next moment. The others didn't dare to breathe too loudly. After a while, the giant blue beetle loosened its grip and the sword fell to the sand beside Yiken's feet. After dropping the sword, the giant blue beetle turned and left. Yiken looked at the sword beside his feet. He squatted down and gripped the hilt with trembling hands. There were some scratches on the blade, but they weren't deep. The blade wasn't damaged either. Yiken's palm brushed across the blade, wiping away the sand on it. The blade was still shiny, carrying with it a sense of holiness. The sun was still blazing above his head, but the blade was chilly. It was as warm as the sand underground. Lifting his head to look at the blue beetle that was gradually disappearing into the distance, the sunlight reflected off its back was tinged with a faint blue hue. Yiken's hand on the sword hilt shifted from a grip to a support while his other hand rested on the sword. Lifting the golden patterned sword with both hands, he knelt on the sand that was heated by the sun and bowed towards the departing blue figure. Seeing this, the other blue beetles knelt down in unison, bowing towards the departing blue figure. At this moment, they seemed to have realized something that they had heard of but never experienced before. It was something called faith. Many of them had ancestors who were slaves. They only heard about the tribe from their ancestors when they were alone. Therefore, they didn't understand the tribesmen's feelings of totem worship. But now, they seemed to have touched it. The patterns drawn on their arms, chests, backs and other places seemed to carry a scorching heat that was branded into their hearts. The patterns that used to be laughable had now become sacred, just like how they were now bowing towards the giant blue figure. Perhaps, this bit of faith would be able to support them to survive in the desert. While the blue beetles knelt down in unison, the vipers exchanged glances. Kneel or not? Would they be eaten if they didn't? It was better to kneel. Since they had chosen to join the blue beetles and their leader had knelt, how could they still stand? If they didn't show their loyalty now, when would they? Hence, after the blue beetles, the vipers who had chosen to side with them knelt down as well. Under the worship of hundreds of people, the giant blue beetle left and disappeared under the sand. The little beetles that lingered nearby also left, burrowing into the sand. Soon, they were nowhere to be seen. This time, the insect tide had really retreated. It had completely retreated. When there was not a single beetle to be seen, Yiken stood up with his sword in hand. He stared ahead with a deep gaze, feeling as if he had been reborn. He was beginning to understand what the elders had said. After ordering his subordinates to count those who had chosen to side with them, Yiken walked into the sandstone house. This morning, it was still Black Sand's mansion. Now, it had a new owner. However, Yiken didn't think much of this place. He walked towards a stone table. On it was a piece of animal skin that Black Sand had written earlier. On it was written the terms of cooperation. It was a cooperation, but all the terms listed on it treated the blue beetles as slaves. This was also why Yiken didn't agree to it. Before the giant blue beetle appeared, under Black Sand's coercion, the others looked at him and waited for him to make a decision. Perhaps some of them wanted to agree at the last minute and think of a solution after this hurdle. However, Yiken knew that as long as he agreed now, Black Sand would hand over the agreement he had written long ago and return them to their status as slaves. Even if the giant blue beetle hadn't appeared, Yiken wouldn't have agreed. He was even prepared to fight to the death, but he didn't expect. A slight pain came from his palm. Frowning, Yiken wiped the blood on his palm onto the animal skin. Then, he swung his sword and chopped the animal skin into pieces. Walking out of the sandstone house, Yiken lifted his head and looked in a direction. That was where the Sky Waters Desert Robbers' underground palace was located. They had experienced despair and all sorts of hardships. In the future, they would experience even more glorious things. The Desert Robbers' location was going to be a huge storm. Xiaofan didn't plan to ask about the Desert Robbers' plans. The presence of Desert Robbers would definitely pose a threat to Rock Hill City. Even if the current leader of the Desert Robbers wasn't experienced enough and their strength hadn't really improved, they would pose a threat to other forces in the desert in the future. It would be best if they could restrain Rock Hill City. As for Sapphire, the sacred relic that Yiken and the others worshipped, it was here because Xiaofan asked it to. Of course, Xiaofan wasn't just here for the two desert robber groups. He had Sapphire fight with Black Sand because he wanted Black Sand to be Sapphire's whetstone. After unlocking Sapphire's fourth lock, Xiaofan didn't know how capable it would be. He needed to test it out in real combat. Besides, Sapphire lived in the desert. The enhancement and physical changes brought about by the fourth lock were all to adapt to the desert environment. It was suitable for survival here and there were more beetles around it. It couldn't follow Xiaofan to Yanjiao's headquarters. If Xiaofan brought Sapphire out of the desert to other places, Sapphire wouldn't be able to unleash its full potential. Therefore, Xiaofan didn't plan to bring it out of the desert. This was the most suitable place for it. However, there were still people from Rock Hill City in the desert, as well as many scattered bands of desert bandits. Perhaps the bandits had yet to develop and their leaders hadn't had enough time to improve, but humans were complex and cunning. In order to survive in the desert, Sapphire needed to understand more. Sapphire could learn all of these through its battle with Black Sand. Although Black Sand had broken through his shackles, which meant he had truly taken over the power his former slave master had given him. However, the power in his body wasn't stable enough. He hadn't developed enough as a whole. Just like a tribesman who had just merged with a fire seed, he hadn't fully absorbed the fire seed's power. Currently, Black Sand didn't have the upper hand against Sapphire. This was why Xiaofan didn't worry about Sapphire testing the waters. However, Black Sand's sword could cause some damage to Sapphire. Although it wasn't as good as Heng's sword, it was still a sword made by the Gongjia family. It could be used as a personal signature sword. It wasn't easy to leave a scratch on Sapphire's back. Xiaofan wanted Sapphire to know that creatures that looked weaker than it could still fight back. They could even use tricks. Sapphire needed to come up with a countermeasure too. When one's power wasn't absolute, one needed to be smarter. The insect swarm was eye-catching enough. Xiaofan hoped Sapphire could learn more from this experience. This was his first slave. Xiaofan didn't want it to become cannon fodder in the desert. Fortunately, Sapphire was smart. When it first created the sand waterfall, it looked like it was defending and attacking, but in reality, it was testing Black Sand and the sword. The sand and the sand waterfall rubbed against the sword, allowing Sapphire to understand the sword's general condition. It could confirm whether it could withstand the attack with its back armor. Once it confirmed that the sword couldn't really hurt it, it seized the opportunity and Black Sand could forget about escaping. Searching for food in the desert was never easy. Beasts would cherish every opportunity. Hence, Black Sand couldn't escape even if he wanted to. As for why the beetles didn't attack Yiken, it was because Sapphire told them not to get close to Yiken. With the beetles' abilities, they couldn't differentiate between too many people and execute overly complicated orders. Hence, it was impossible for Xiaofan to have them all avoid the blue beetles. Hence, he settled for the next best thing, which was to avoid Yiken. Xiaofan was interested in the blue beetles, but Sapphire no longer remembered them. Xiaofan couldn't understand the truth. If Xiaofan wasn't here, the insect swarm would have attacked indiscriminately. In fact, Yiken would have followed in Black Sand's footsteps. After this incident, Xiaoxian told Sapphire to remember Yiken's scent. If it encountered his men in the future, as long as they didn't attack Sapphire, it wouldn't lead the insect swarm to attack Yiken's men. After all, their totem was the blue dung ball-pushing beetle. Since the blue beetles regarded Sapphire as their religion, it was best to let this misunderstanding continue. Outside Viper's small town, skeletons could be seen occasionally. They belonged to people who failed to escape when the insect swarm appeared. Xiaoxian returned to where Yanjiao's men were waiting. "Are you okay?" Ta and the others hurried over to ask. They heard the commotion in the small town and saw the insect swarm. Ta said that he wouldn't make a move until Xiaoxian gave the signal. As expected, the insect swarm appeared not long after. They didn't dare to step into the area where the insect swarm occurred. They weren't Xiaoxian, they wouldn't be attacked by the insect swarm. Many of the snake tribesmen ran out in all directions. Some ran in this direction, and the flaming horn tribesmen killed them on the spot. Otherwise, they would be exposed. Xiaoxian had the beetles deal with the corpses on the ground. Once they were buried in the sand, there was no trace of them. They couldn't stay here for long. Perhaps the blue beetles would arrive soon to take over the remaining Viper forces. Not many people knew about Xiaoxian's relationship with the insect swarm. At least, the desert robbers didn't know. Perhaps they would find out in the future, but for now, it was best not to tell them. Viper's small town wasn't a good place to rest. It made the 5 captured men nervous. They would rather sleep on the sand than go to the small town. Coincidentally, the Yanjiao people didn't want to be with the desert robbers either. They left and headed out of the desert. Gongjiaren and the other 5 were on Sapphire's back. After receiving food and water and applying medicine to their wounds, they felt much better after some rest. Elder Xiaoxian. Gongjia Kan, the oldest of the 5, spoke carefully. "What is it?" Xiaoxian looked at Gongjia Kan's, that traitor. Gongjia Kan was referring to the traitor of the Gongjia family. "He's been eaten," said Xiaoxian. He watched as the man was swallowed by the insect swarm. Hearing that the traitor had been eaten by the insects, the 6 Gongjia members heaved a sigh of relief. At least the traitor had been punished. However, they soon sighed. They were all implicated and forced to come out. Who would have thought that the traitor would betray them and even lead the desert bandits to capture them, only to end up like this? "Why? Do you feel bad?" said Lei. If a Yanjiao member betrayed his own family, he would be hunted down. Even if he escaped far away, we would do everything we could to kill him. Like that person, the one who betrayed his own family and sought refuge with the slave master? "Dao Yu," said Tuo. Yes, that's him. Dao Yu. Even though he sought refuge with the slave master and lived well in the desert, didn't he get killed by Xian in the end? When Lei mentioned Dao Yu, Xiaoxian thought of what happened back then. If it was as he guessed, Dao Yu was considered dead but had not disappeared. He was just alive, in another state. Somewhere in the desert, a team of 200 people walked on the sand. Unlike the desert robbers, this team's formation was more unique. The most eye-catching was, of course, the giant golden beast walking in the middle. The giant beast was oval-shaped, but not as flat as Sapphire. It was longer, and when it walked, one could see rings of expansion and contraction marks on its back, as if it was made up of several sections. The seemingly heavy back armor armed most of its body, with long legs protruding from its body. There were many legs, supporting the entire body's movements. On the back of this giant beast, there was a metal frame covered with some cloth curtains, blocking Yangguang. It looked like a small house with a person lying on a wide chair. "Have you found the person?" A lazy voice came from inside. A short and fat figure quickly approached the giant beast, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He said respectfully, "Third young master, not yet." Above, the cloth curtains were lifted and a hard, fist-sized fruit core was thrown out, mercilessly smashing towards the man's head. A cold voice followed, "Then hurry up and find him." Chapter 747. After receiving the 6 Gongjia members, the Yanjiao people did not stay any longer. They left the desert as quickly as possible. Just because they did not encounter any obstacles before, it did not mean that things would go smoothly later on. Just like before, they spent more time traveling at night and would rest during the day. Sometimes, they would sleep less because they were in a hurry. When they were hunting in the forest, the Yanjiao warriors would occasionally stay up all night. They were just not used to the desert environment, so their speed was limited. However, they still had the stamina to travel. On the way back, the Yanjiao people told the Gongjia members about the Yanjiao tribe's living conditions. Gongjiaren and the rest had planned to live in a tribe that hunted all day long, hidden in the depths of the forest. They would live in simple houses made of wood and stone, use metal tools they no longer used, wear old, coarse linen clothes, and live with a group of barbaric tribesmen. However, the more they listened, the more they felt that something was amiss. So the Yanjiao people did not live in the depths of the forest. So the Yanjiao people did not only live in simple houses made of wood and stone. So other than hunting, the Yanjiao people also knew how to farm. Their farmlands were not small, and they even reared domesticated animals. So the Yanjiao people had their own trading area? And it was a trading area built like a city? What surprised them even more was the new bronze weapons in the Yanjiao people's hands, and Xiao Xian's knife of unknown material. In terms of hardness, even the best Gongjiaren was not confident that his sword could beat Yanjiao's new bronze weapons. Unbelievable. Were these the tribesmen they had imagined? During their conversation with the Gongjia members, the Yanjiao people noticed that these people's impression of the tribesmen was so backward. This was intolerable. Although their tribe used to be like that, Yanjiao had changed drastically. The Yanjiao people were very angry at Gongjiaren and the rest's opinion of the Yanjiao people. The 6 people were already stunned by the scene described by the Yanjiao people. When they saw that the expressions of the Yanjiao people weren't very good, they knew that they must have offended these people and hurriedly explained. "I'm sorry, we've been staying in the royal city for a long time so we don't know much about tribesmen's lives." Gongjiaren was embarrassed too. The tribesmen he had heard about were really like that. On the other side of the sea, other than the slave masters and nobles who built cities, there were also various organizations and groups that no longer lived as tribes. The 6 Gongjia members were familiar with these, but for the tribesmen who lived in the depths of the forest, far away from cities, and maintained a primitive tribal state, what they heard from others was vastly different from what the Yanjiao people described. Perhaps it was just as Heng had said. Yanjiao was a good place. Things there might not be as bad as before. They had always thought that the tribesmen were lacking in metal weapons. Perhaps there would be a shortage of resources when the time came. However, according to Ta, they had hoarded a lot of metal weapons and even robbed a lot of them. Although they didn't have much resources, it was enough for them to fight. Since they knew that the tribe they were going to rely on was not bad, the most important thing was that they would have the opportunity to showcase their talents and have their own forge. That would be enough. The 6 Gongjia members were looking forward to the new life they were about to live. Their mood improved and they started to talk more with the Yanjiao people. "The most important thing for you to live here is to master the language here. Not every tribe knows the language there," said Xiao Xian. The Yanjiao people knew the language on the other side of the sea and could converse with the 6 Gongjia members because Zheng Luo and the other half of the tribe had influenced each other. Moreover, the people Xiao Xian brought along this time also knew some of the language so they wouldn't be unable to understand the Gongjia members' cries for help. However, once they left the desert and entered the tribesmen's territory, they would have to do as the Romans do. Indeed. Gongjiaren nodded. They had to learn this language. Since they had nothing to do during the journey, the 6 Gongjia members followed the Yanjiao people to learn the language and writing used by the tribesmen. Sometimes, they would even write on the sand when they rested. The medicine the Yanjiao people gave them was of better quality. Now, the 6 Gongjia members could walk and jog. However, they had not fully recovered and could not keep up with the Yanjiao people's speed. That was why they were still on Sapphire's back. "We'll be out of the desert in about 5 to 6 days, said Ta. 5 to 6 days was not a long time. Gongjiaren and the rest had spent much longer in the desert and it was much more difficult. Compared to before, it was much easier now. 5 to 6 days was nothing. "Be careful," said Xiaofan suddenly. Ta and the rest who were drinking water were stunned. "We'll run into trouble?" Xiaofan crushed the straw rope in his hand and threw it into the sand. He mixed it with his foot. At first glance, it was difficult to separate the straw shreds from the dry sand. "We can't avoid it?" asked Ta. "It'll be difficult. They might have followed us here." Xiaofan thought of the Bailuo he met before. He knew that slave masters who had lived in the desert for thousands of years must have many beasts that were good at tracking. They might even have other methods. It would not be easy to shake them off. After hearing Xiaofan's words, the rest became serious. "Rock Hill City?" asked Tua. "It should be them. Anyway, everyone be careful." Gongjiaren and the rest were puzzled as to why Xiaofan could predict what would happen. However, seeing how trusting the Yanjiao people were and how serious the atmosphere in the group was, they did not dare to ask questions. After all, it was for their sake. After that, the group became much quieter. The 6 Gongjiaren members stopped asking questions because the flaming horns were too focused on guarding their surroundings. They had no time to chat with them. "I heard that Rock Hill City created some monsters that can't be killed. Have you guys seen them?" asked Lei. Gongjiaren shook his head. "We've only seen them once from afar. I don't know if they really can't be killed, but after being cut in half, their upper bodies could still move nimbly. They didn't bleed and their bodies were black. When they crossed the sea, there was a chaotic battle there. They took a detour and took a boat. They had only seen them once from afar and it was a very strange scene." The Gongjia members felt chills run down their spines. It was no wonder Royal City had received news that the battle was not going well. Anyone would be afraid of those monsters. When the Flaming Horn tribesmen heard that these monsters would not die even after being cut in half, and that they could even use their arms to move around as if they could not feel any pain, even if the Flaming Horn tribesmen were mentally prepared, they still felt a layer of goosebumps on their arms. "Not even cutting off their heads?" asked Tua. "I don't know." Gongjiaren and the rest really did not know. They had used all their means to avoid the battlefield and their pursuers. They did not pay much attention to the monsters at the time. They did not even have time to run for their lives, let alone observe if the monsters could still move after their heads were cut off. "They can," said Xiaofan. The Yanjiao members and the Gongjia members all looked at Xiaofan. Other than Ta, who knew part of the reason, the rest did not know. Those monsters have no internal organs, including their hearts. Their heads are not the core of their bodies. Of course, cutting off their heads will definitely affect them, but they can still move. Xiaofan continued, "That's why if you encounter them, you can first cut off their heads, then their limbs. However, they will not die, so you must be careful. There might be a sneak attack with a severed arm or something." Everyone felt their hair stand on end at Xiaofan's words. Gongjiaren even touched his neck unconsciously. When he heard Xiaofan say cut off their limbs, he touched his arm again. He felt his hair stand on end. After all, they grew up in a different environment from the Yanjiao people. These words were more impactful to them. Although the Yinjiao members were horrified, they still remembered Xiaoxian's words. Remember, they are just puppets. They are controlled by someone. They have no life, they cannot bleed, they do not feel pain, and they do not have self-awareness. Other than their strong bodies, they are no different from withered wood. The key lies in the person controlling them. If there is a chance, I will kill the person controlling the puppets first, continued Xiaoxian. The Yinjiao members nodded, indicating that they remembered. Since those puppets could not be considered human and were no different from wood, they would treat these dead humans the same way they treated wood. Under everyone's vigilance, they walked for another 2 days. On this day, Xiaoxian heard the cry of an eagle in the distance. It was the cry of a cha-cha. They're here. Xiaoxian looked in a direction. They're fast. Soon, Ta sensed someone approaching at a speed much faster than their speed. It was no wonder Xiaoxian said they might not be able to avoid it. The Yinjiao members were on high alert. In the distance, where the sand met the sky, dust began to roll. A giant figure reflected the golden light, the most eye-catching of all. It was a giant oval-shaped beast. From the reflection of the light, one could tell that its entire body was covered in hard armor. There were people on the back of the giant beast, but they were blocked by a cloth curtain, so one could not see who was inside. There were other people around the giant golden beast, all wearing golden armor. They were very similar to the Jinjiao guards Xiaoxian had seen before. Xiaoxian's gaze swept over the people closest to the giant beast. Although they were all wearing armor and gave Xiaoxian a similar feeling to the Jinjiao guards, Xiaoxian was more concerned about the people running on the periphery. Those people were wearing thick cotton clothes and looked very low-key. Even their heads were covered. If they were ordinary people, they would definitely be sweating from wearing such clothes and running so vigorously under such a hot sun. The people wearing golden armor around the giant beast were relatively normal. One could see that they were tired, but these people didn't seem to feel it at all. They didn't seem to be tired at all. It was them. They were the legendary freaks. Only those who no longer had self-awareness, knew no pain, knew no fatigue, and knew no cold or heat could move like a machine. Even the movement of their feet was neat and tidy. If that was all, they would look more like well-trained soldiers. In reality, they were just puppets. Now that they were close, the sand and dust had limited cover. A gust of wind could be seen. There were about 200 people. Among these 200 people, there were 100 people in armor and close to 100 freaks. They were split evenly between the two sides. Seeing that there was a giant beast, the 6 Gongjia members dismounted from Sapphire's back. Sapphire was obviously going to participate in the battle and could not carry them all the time. Moreover, they could walk and run now. They held the new bronze weapons given by the Yinjiao people and stood together. The Yinjiao people surrounded them in the middle. The troop was getting closer and closer, only slowing down when they were 100 meters away. They walked forward a little more before stopping. The people of the Flaming Horn tribe noticed that the 100 people closest to the giant beast could clearly hear the sound of their breathing after they stopped. Even though they were wearing armor, they could see the rise and fall of their chests. Even the giant beast seemed to be panting. When it lowered its head, the sand on the ground was blown up. However, the people standing at the periphery were not even breathing, let alone panting. After they stopped, they stood there stiffly like they were made of wood. Due to the thick linen cloth, their faces could not be seen clearly. However, the Yinjiao people had already guessed that these people were the freaks everyone was talking about. When Sapphire saw the giant beast, it walked to Xiaoxian's side and raised its 2 long forelimbs, looking at the giant beast threateningly. It was difficult for giant beasts to get along with each other. Hand over the Gongjia people. A cold voice came from the back of the giant golden armored beast. They could not see the person's face through the cloth, but they could hear the thick arrogance and disdain in the voice. Without waiting for an answer, the person continued, "Which one of you is Gongjiaren? Step forward." Xiaofan raised an eyebrow. Ta and the rest's expressions changed too. Why did the person only call out Gongjiaren's name? However, they did not look at Gongjiaren. Xiaofan waved his hand behind his back, indicating that they did not need to answer. The person waited for a while but did not receive a reply. His voice lowered again, this time with an obvious threat. "Which one is Gongjiaren? If you don't answer, you'll all die." Xiaofan thought carefully about the voice. It sounded familiar, but it had been too long since they last met. "And who are you?" asked Xiaofan. "Shut up. You haven't answered the young master's question." An armored man took 2 steps forward, pointing at Xiaofan as he shouted. Then, a slightly gloomy voice came from behind the cloth on the insect's back. "Second young master, don't waste time. Kill a few people first and they'll talk." "You're right." It was the same voice from before, but it did not have the arrogance it had when facing Xiaofan and the rest. It seemed to be afraid of the person who spoke. "Second young master?" "Luoya City's second young master, Su Lu." Xiaofan suddenly remembered this person. When they first entered the desert, they were in Luoya City. Luoya City's king, Su Luan, had 3 sons. The first young master, Su Ka, second young master, Su Lu, and third young master, Su Gu. They were half-brothers, but their relationship was like fire and water. Back then, it was because of Xiaofan that Su Gu snatched the spot that should have been Su Li's to go to Beast City. As soon as Xiaofan spoke, the man on the golden beast's back lifted the cloth curtain and looked down. Then, his eyes turned sharp and cold. "Yinjiao's Xiaofan?" Every word was squeezed out from the gaps between his teeth. Even Gongjiaren and the rest could feel the intense hatred. The rest of Yinjiao looked at Xiaofan, asking with their eyes, "Does this person have a grudge against you?" Even Xiaofan did not expect Su Lu to remember him. It had been so long, but he still remembered him so clearly. Of course, Su Lu remembered it clearly. If it weren't for Xiaofan, Su Gu wouldn't have had the opportunity to follow his father to the Beast City. He wouldn't have been qualified to participate in some important affairs, and he wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop to the point where he could compete with him today. Su Lu was a vengeful person. Even if it had been a long time, he would still remember those who had offended him. Of course, he remembered Xiaofan. While Su Lu and Xiaofan were confronting each other, somewhere further away, a team similar to Su Li's was also advancing. Even the giant beast was of the same species. A short and fat person trembled and ran to the side of the golden beast. He said to the man on the beast's back, "Third young master. There's news." "Oh? Hurry up and tell me. Did the other team find him first?" The man lying on the beast's back casually picked up a fruit and took a big bite, as if venting his anger. The other team had taken the lead again. He could tell that Su Gu was not in a good mood. The short and fat person braced himself and said, "Yes, second young master has found them. However, there are people protecting them. I think they're from the Yinjiao tribe. This is strange. Why would the Yinjiao tribe come here? Pfft." Su Gu spat out the fruit he had just bitten and tossed half of the crispy fruit away. He shouted, "Come up here and talk." The short and fat man was shocked, but he reacted quickly and climbed onto the beast's back. He looked clumsy, but his movements were agile. He leaped onto the beast's back and came before the curtain. He bowed and said, "We've just received news that the Yinjiao tribe took the Gongjia family members away. Second young master is now fighting for them. Third young master, do you think we should hurry over? If we're too slow, the Gongjia family members will be taken away." The short and fat man waited for Su Gu's reply. He thought it was strange and asked again, "Young master, I'm not going." A voice came from inside. Yes. Immediately. What? The short and fat man thought he had heard wrongly. Didn't the third young master and the second young master fight fiercely? They had to fight for everything. After all, the lord of Luoya city, Su Luan, had said that only one person could inherit his things. Now, among Su Luan's living children, only the second young master, Su Lu, and the third young master, Su Gu were left. In the past, everyone thought it would be the eldest young master, Su Ka, and the second young master, Su Lu, who would fight for the right to be the lord of Luoya city. However, after the desert incident, the lord of Luoya city was no longer called the lord of Luoya city. Even so, the current Luoya city was at least twice as big as before. As for the title of lord, it didn't matter much since they couldn't surpass Rock Hill's city. The city was twice as big, with more resources and wealth. They could even be entrusted with important tasks by the Rock Hill city king. This was a huge temptation. Su Luan's decision still didn't change. He said that there would only be one heir, and almost all the resources and wealth. Therefore, at that time, many people thought it would be a fight between the eldest young master and the second young master. However, they didn't expect that the eldest young master would encounter an accident during a mission and be killed by people from the other side of the sea. Only the second and third young masters were left. At that time, many people still thought that since the eldest young master was gone, then the second young master would definitely inherit the throne. However, the third young master, Su Gu, rose to power. Now, the two young masters were almost evenly matched. Everything was fiercely fought. If it was in the past, after receiving a mission, once he heard that Su Lu would arrive first, Su Gu would definitely be anxious and urge him to hurry. However, this time, it was different. I said I'm not going, and I'm not going. Didn't you hear me? After a pause, Su Gu said again, slow down. There's no need to rush. Yes. The short and fat man wiped the sweat from his forehead, thinking that the third young master was really hard to please. Just now, he said he wouldn't go, and the next thing he said was to slow down. Would he regret it after a while? No matter what, the team had already slowed down according to Su Gu's request. The originally hurried team now looked like they were taking a stroll, lazy and leisurely. Why are they from the Yanjiao tribe? Su Gu was troubled. If the Yanjiao people came, then the leader was most likely Xiaofan. To be honest, Su Gu was a little afraid of Xiaofan. This was something he felt from the beginning in Luoya city. Later on, some things made him even more afraid of Xiaofan. However, he wasn't willing to give up just like that. That was why he asked the team to slow down. It would be best if the Yanjiao people and Su Li's people were both injured when they arrived. That would save him a lot of trouble. Chapter 748. Under the scorching sun, two groups of people stood facing each other amidst the endless yellow sands. Su Lu glared at Xiaofan with a murderous glint in his eyes. If possible, he wanted to personally chop Xiaofan up and feed him to the slaves. However, Su Lu cherished his life. He knew that Xiaofan was not easy to deal with. Although he hadn't seen it with his own eyes back then, he had heard of the situation in the Colosseum. Su Lu didn't want to take the risk. If he died, the right to inherit Autumn Fall would only go to that idiot Su Gu. However, with Su Li's current status, he didn't need to go personally. He was a slave master and had slaves under his command. Ever since the situation in the desert changed, he had also trained some of his better slaves. He only needed to leave the fighting to the slaves while he watched from the sidelines. Not to mention, Su Lu tilted his head slightly to look at a person seated diagonally behind him. This person was dressed in the same way as the silent people outside the group. They were all dressed in grayish-white sackcloth. The only difference was that while the silent people had their heads wrapped in sackcloth, this person only had his head covered by a hood. Only the lower half of his pale face could be seen. When the light was dim, not even a hint of his expression could be seen. In the desert, most people's skin was tan due to the sun. However, this person looked like he had not seen Yangguang for a long time. He even gave off a sickly pale feeling. There was more than one person like this in Rock Hill City. Some participated in the coastal war while others followed the slave masters. His third brother also had such a person beside him. These people were the ones who controlled the monsters on the outskirts. Although having such people around made him uncomfortable, on the other hand, they were also a protective force. With these people around, Sulu felt a lot more at ease. The slaves under his command were also slowly being depleted. Glancing at the people behind him, Sulu felt more confident. He had 100 slaves on his side and 100 monsters on his side. Looking at Yanjiao's side, he counted no more than 50. Comparing the beasts, his beasts were obviously bigger than Xiao Xian's. Moreover, the beetle did not seem to be very powerful. With this comparison, Su Li's confidence increased once again. Hence, Su Li's eyes flashed with viciousness. If it had been anyone else, he might have let them go after they handed over the Gongjia family members. After all, the battle was exhausting and he could not bear to part with his subordinates. Training these slaves was not easy. But Yanjiao people? He would not leave a single one of them alive. He could even bring the Yanjiao corpses back to claim his reward. Su Lu pulled on a metal bell beside him. Immediately, a slave came over. 8 armored slaves unloaded the hut from the back of the giant beast and carried it steadily like a palanquin. They were afraid that their hands would accidentally shake and make the people inside angry. Looking at their practiced movements, they must have done it many times. "Be careful, it's coming," Xiao Xian warned. The hut that was removed from the giant beast's body was only to allow the giant beast to participate in the battle without affecting the people inside. Su Lu sat inside and was carried to the back of the group. The golden-armored people surrounded him while the silent people stood at the front and the outermost circle. Without any worries, the giant golden beast's pants like teeth moved and let out a howl like a gust of wind. It lifted its upper body and bent its dozens of legs downwards, exposing its abdomen that was almost touching the ground. Although its abdomen was not as heavily armored as its sides and back, it was still hard armor, albeit lighter in color. Then, the golden-armored beast smashed its upper body into the ground like a spiked club. The sandy ground shook violently as if a boulder had fallen or a mountain had collapsed. It was as if a sudden clap of thunder rang in their ears. Those who were close by felt their heads hurt and their chest churn. The 6 Gongjia members felt a sense of oppression. When they were escaping, they had never encountered a giant beast like this. Even if they had only seen it from afar. If they had encountered a giant beast like this, they would have died long ago. After the rumble, waves of sand rose and spread towards the Yanjiao people. The waves spread to the feet of the Yanjiao people. Even those who stood 100 meters away felt their footing become unstable. It was as if they were standing on a small boat in the middle of a storm, swaying and swaying. The giant golden figure stirred up a gust of sand that rubbed against the giant golden beast's armor. It was as if sand was being polished against hard metal, producing a sharp sizzling sound. Gongjiaren lifted his sleeves to cover his nose and mouth, squinting his eyes into thin slits to prevent the sand from entering his eyes. His slightly wide sleeves flapped under the wind and sand, and his hair was almost blown parallel to the ground. This giant beast was not easy to deal with. Then, what should the Yanjiao people do? Gongjiaren looked around. To Gongjiaren's surprise, the Yanjiao people did not show any signs of fear or nervousness. It was as if the giant golden beast's performance was nothing more than a normal gust of wind. In reality, that was indeed the case. They were not pretending to be calm. The Yinjiao people really did not think much of the giant golden beast. What's with the pretense? We've even seen the king's stoneworm. This giant beast may give Gongjiaoren and the rest a lot of pressure. However, to the Yinjiao people who were used to giant beasts, hunting fearsome beasts, and even a few king beasts, they were not affected much. The Yinjiao people only turned to glance at the giant golden beast, then turned their attention back to the masked and silent people. They were more concerned about these so-called monsters. However, the Yinjiao people's silence made Su Le think they were afraid. That's all you have? Forget it, hand over Gongjiaoren and the rest and I'll give you time to leave, said Su Le slowly, as if this was a rare gift. He gave them time to leave but did not say how much time they would be given, nor did he mention how he would hunt them down. At this, Xiaofan smiled and looked in the direction of the wind. You think you have an advantage in numbers? You want to bully us with numbers? So what if I do? Su Le thought it was normal to bully others with numbers. It was also the safest and he liked it the most. It would be abnormal if it was the other way around. Nothing. Xiaofan raised his right forefoot and stomped down. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly. It was not as strong as the giant golden beast but it traveled far. The air around them seemed to change slightly with this stomp, as if muffled thunder was coming from under Xiaofan's feet. The sound was not loud, as if it came from afar, but also from underground. A layer of sand on the ground spread outwards in a circle, expanding rapidly. Soon, it had passed by Su Le's side. The armored men standing around Su Le felt a gentle gust of wind graze their feet. However, they had the illusion that a cold hand had gripped their feet, sending chills down their spines. The weather was hot and they had been traveling for a long time, so it should have been very hot. However, they couldn't help but shiver with an ominous premonition. Young master, something's wrong, Su Le found it strange too. He pulled the cloth aside and looked outside. Suddenly, he shuddered. Beetles. He saw small black beetles appearing on the sand. One by one, they looked like they could be stomped to death. However, more and more beetles appeared. This gave him an ominous feeling. He then looked at the giant blue beetle beside Xiaofan. Su Le took a deep breath. His fingers trembled and he released the cloth. He swallowed his saliva. His voice was filled with suppressed shock. Insect tide. When did the horrors of the insect tide become known to everyone? When did it spread? In Su Le's memories, even though there were cases of beetles chewing on the corpses of battle beasts in the early days, that wasn't the start of their panic. The true terror that the insect swarm brought upon them started from an incident in the past. Back then, the Snowfield King sent 200 golden armored guards to hunt down Xiaofan. However, not a single one of them returned. It was said that those who went out to search for the golden armored guards found the skeletons of the golden armored guards somewhere in the desert. All that was left were pale white bones, tattered clothes, and the golden armor that they were so proud of. They were half buried in the sand, filled with the aura of death. Even if one didn't see it with their own eyes, they could imagine such a strange scene just by hearing it from others. Although the rumor was exaggerated, the 200 golden armored guards might not have all died under the insect tide. However, the complete disappearance of the 200 golden armored guards was most likely related to the insect tide. It was also from then on that the insect tide became another disaster in the desert that caused everyone's expression to change. The slaves under Su Le's command were indeed armed according to the famous golden armor guards of Snowfield City. He and Su Gu had done the same thing. The armors on these slaves were also made in the same batch, and Su Luan had distributed them later. It was a fair distribution of resources before the Lord of Luoya City chose his successor. Back then, the golden armored guards of Snowfield City, who were as cruel and bloody as a meat grinder, couldn't escape the insect tide. What would happen to his slaves? Su Lu was indeed proud of having a team of slaves armed with golden armor. However, he also knew that there was still a gap between his slaves and the golden-armored guards of Snowfield City. As he thought about it, Su Lu felt a chill run down his spine. His teeth chattered. So this was what Xiaofan meant when he said bully with numbers. The black insects that rushed out from under the sand had formed a tide of insects. As far as the eye could see, the black tide of insects almost blocked most of the view. The black beetles swarmed towards Su Lu like a tidal wave. The armored slaves screamed and slapped away the beetles that pounced on them. However, more and more beetles squeezed through the gaps between their armor and their clothes. The beasts that the slaves rode stomped their hooves in horror, flinging the people off their backs. The originally neat formation became a mess. However, there were exceptions. Xiaofan looked at the situation with a solemn expression. They're avoiding the monsters. Those beetles, whether it was fresh or rotten meat, would not leave anything behind. However, when faced with the monsters, it was as if they didn't want to get close to them. They were very repulsive and even took a detour when they rushed past them. Compared to the panicked golden-armored slaves, the people who were covered in linen standing on the periphery were like wooden blocks. They didn't react to their surroundings at all. Chapter 749. On the vast expanse of yellow sand filled with undulations and folds, screams of agony and roars of beasts echoed incessantly. The first to suffer were the armored slaves. Black beetles surged out from the sand like a tidal wave. In the blink of an eye, they had surrounded the armored slaves who were standing at the front. Like hungry wolves, the black beetles pounced on them one after another. There were too many beetles. Even if the slaves managed to shake them off, there would still be other beetles swarming in. Even the slightest carelessness would allow the beetles to seize the opportunity to burrow into the armors and gnaw on them. After a frantic roar, a slave in golden armor could no longer hold on. He staggered and fell to the ground. He had just shaken off a wave of beetles and exposed his upper body to the black tide to catch his breath. But in the next moment, he was enveloped again. His face had been gnawed into a bloody mess. The smell of blood stimulated the beetles, causing them to become even more frenzied. There were too many of them. Psychologically speaking, the slaves had already broken down. Strangely, other than the monsters standing at the outermost periphery, the beetles didn't approach the small house surrounded by the cloth tent. Even the slaves who were caught in the tide of beetles were squeezing towards that side. Xiaofan felt like he was witnessing the same scene that Yiken had encountered earlier. However, the difference was that Yiken wasn't attacked by the beetles back then because of Xiaofan and Sapphire. The current situation was different, just like how the beetles didn't approach the monsters. Seeing that the beetles weren't coming closer, Su Li's heart calmed down. His greatest fear had been resolved. As long as he was fine, everything was fine. The slaves' deaths made him feel terrible. It wasn't because he was sad but because the bond between slaves and slave owners would be forcefully severed after a slave's death. The tighter the bond between the slave and the slave owner, the more intense the feeling would be when the bond was severed. These slaves in golden armor were all carefully trained by him. The deaths of the slaves devoured by the beetles were like a hammer to his head. His head hurt like it was about to split open and his heart was filled with anxiety. Fortunately, judging from the current situation, the beetles weren't omnipotent. At least, they were useless against those people. Su Li's eyes shone with a vicious light as he roared, "Kill them all." The golden-plated beast was already charging towards them. It was a beast enslaved by Su Lu. Before the changes in the desert, such a beast would have been brought to the bestial battle arena. However, the bestial battle arena had been closed for a long time now. These beasts had also become a part of the battle. They were also the beasts that Su Lu would ride on whenever he went out on a mission. "Go," Xiaofan said to Sapphire. In terms of size, Sapphire was not as large as the giant golden beast, and its tonnage was also a notch lower, but Xiaofan had faith in Sapphire. The collision of the two giant beasts seemed to have created a storm in the desert. The flying sand and dust made everything on the ground blurry. The strange people who had been standing there silently also began to move. The slaves were too intimidated by the insect swarm to charge forward. Su Lo couldn't bear to send his well-trained slaves to their deaths either, so he had no choice but to let the weirdos do it. How could those freaks defeat the Yinzhou people? After all, they still had the advantage in terms of numbers. Protect them! Ta shouted to the warriors surrounding the 6 Gongjia members. The Yinzhou people pulled out swords, axes, spears and other weapons covered in animal hide. When they came to the desert, they brought 2 types of weapons. One was a new bronze weapon, and the other was an ordinary bronze weapon. Most of the time, unless they were dealing with the beasts in the desert, they would only use ordinary weapons. As for the new bronze weapons, they were all covered up. After all, this kind of weapon was too unique, so they had to cover it up. But now that they were going to fight, of course they would not hold back, and there was no need to cover it up. The totemic power in their bodies surged. In the blink of an eye, the Yinzhou people had fully unleashed their auras. Totemic patterns appeared on their bodies. There were no shouts or howls, only silent as they charged forward. When they hunted in the forest, they did not roar often, unless the hunt was nearing its end or under special circumstances, such as a group hunt, or using their roars to chase away beasts. Now, they maintained the same habit in battle. The giant axe in his hand swung mercilessly, colliding with the weapon in the freak's hand. The brute force forced the other party to retreat. The axe-wielding Yinzhou person's shoulders shook to dissipate the force, then he raised his arm and swung it again. The warrior who was holding the long spear had already replaced the green spearhead. With a shake of the long handle, a hole seemed to have been opened up in the sand. The spearhead was like a sharp fang that locked onto its prey, biting towards the man whose head was wrapped in linen cloth. Ear-piercing sounds of collisions rang out everywhere. The Yinzhou people followed Xiaoxian's advice and attacked the other party's head first. The spear pierced through the throat of one of the masked men, leaving a hole. If it were a normal person, blood would have gushed out of the wound. However, after the masked men's throats were pierced, not only was there no blood spurting out of the wound, but their movements were also not affected. Some of them even used their heads as weapons to attack. It looked like they were prepared to perish together with the masked men. Xiaoxian sighed inwardly. It was just as he had expected. These were people who had died long ago. The ones here were just puppets under their control. They had no sense of pain or consciousness. No matter how strong a beast was, it would still have some self-defense mechanisms in battle. For example, when their vitals were threatened, they would dodge or block. However, these freaks did not seem to know that. Everything they did was to attack, and every attack was filled with killing intent. They could not be called humans. They were more like killing machines. Xiaoxian pushed off the ground with his right leg and instantly took 2 steps back to avoid the other party's head. These freaks were not afraid of pain. They were fearless and did not have any emotional fluctuations. They would not be affected by the outside world. Even if they were injured, they would not be affected. However, Xiaoxian could not ignore them. He twisted his ankle and stopped his retreat. The knife in his hand descended like a bolt of lightning. It cut through the air with a hissing sound, as if it was rubbing against sand. The blade flashed with a bright light as it beheaded the freak in front of him. Where the other Yinzhou people were, heads wrapped in linen could be seen being chopped off one by one. There was no blood at the cut, only some black, shriveled flesh. The headless freaks only paused for a moment before continuing to attack. It was as if they had not lost their heads, but only a strand of hair. However, if one looked closely, they would notice that these headless freaks were less agile than they had been at the beginning. The experienced Yanjiao people naturally noticed this as well. They were more and more convinced by Xiao Xian's suggestion. Sure enough, it was effective. However, even if this method could have a certain effect, seeing the headless people still standing, as if their movements weren't affected, and they could still continue to fight with their weapons, everyone couldn't help but have a strange feeling in their hearts. Su Lu, who was watching from the sidelines, naturally noticed that the Yanjiao people's actions seemed to be planned. However, compared to that, Su Lu was more concerned about the things in the Yanjiao people's hands. When he saw the green weapons in the Yanjiao people's hands, Su Li's eyebrows shot up. He was so shocked that his jaw dropped. He suspected that his eyes were playing tricks on him. He pulled open the cloth curtain in front of him and stared with wide eyes at the things in the Yanjiao people's hands. He had seen similar green weapons before. However, they weren't weapons that they could use. Apart from a small number of core personnel who participated in the battle near the coast, no one else possessed such weapons. Even his father, Su Luan, only had one. It was said that it was an even tougher weapon. There were very few such green weapons. Even young masters like him might not own one. If they wanted one, they would have to exchange for it with contributions. However, why did the Yanjiao people have them too? Was it possible? Could it be that they just looked alike? In order to find out, Su Lu continued to observe. His focus was on the weapons. As for the Yanjiao people's planned actions, he didn't care anymore. In his opinion, these freaks were immortal. Even if they were dismembered, they would still be able to continue fighting. He didn't think that these freaks would be defeated. Defeated? How was that possible? Even the person sitting quietly behind Su Lu couldn't help but look up when he saw the green weapons in the Yanjiao people's hands. He didn't sit quietly with his eyelids lowered. However, compared to the agitated Su Lu, this person's expression was indifferent. His gray eyes were like a lifeless desert. The sound of metal clashing against metal was ear-piercing. Su Li's heart raced as he watched the weapons in the freak's hands break with every collision. Yes. That's it. Actually, the weapons in the freak's hands were already better than the ones used by the desert robbers. However, these weapons were no match for the green weapons in the Yanjiao people's hands. Su Li's breathing quickened. His original plan was to bring the Gongjia family members back, complete this mission, and reap some benefits at the same time. Who would have thought that he would encounter something so good? Su Lu didn't want to think about how the Yanjiao people got their green weapons. The only thing he wanted to do now was to snatch all the green weapons in the Yanjiao people's hands. There were so many of them. Perhaps he would have to hand in some of them when he returned, but he could definitely keep some for himself. Even if he couldn't keep much, bringing them back would still be a great contribution. Kill! Kill them all, yelled Su Lu. As long as he killed all the Yanjiao people, everything in the Yanjiao people's hands would naturally belong to him. The people behind Su Lu had the same thought. Their eyes, which had been calm all this while, suddenly lit up. The attacks of the strange people covered in sackcloth grew fiercer and fiercer. They were already fighting with their lives on the line, but now, it was more like a suicidal attack. Fortunately, the Yanjiao people had already beheaded many of the freaks in the beginning. The situation was alleviated, but even so, these freaks still put a lot of pressure on the Yanjiao people. Thump! A monster's body was cut in half. His upper body fell to the ground, but his lower body was still moving. After losing his legs, his upper body used one arm as a leg, while the other arm continued to attack the flaming horn tribesmen again and again. There was no blood. It was such a brutal scene, but there was no sign of blood. However, under this seemingly bloodless killing field, there was a murderous aura that made one shudder. The 6 Gongjiaran members watched the battle with shock and fear written all over their faces. They suppressed the churning emotions in their hearts. It was unbelievable. When they escaped from the other side of the sea, just watching from afar was enough to make their scalps go numb. Now, the scene was even clearer than before. It was as if a heavy hammer was pounding on the hearts of the Wuxia members. Even their hair seemed to be trembling. The freaks who were sliced in half continued to fight. Their heads were chopped off, but their headless bodies continued to attack the Yanjiao people. Their arms were chopped off, but they could still wield their swords to chop off the Yanjiao people's legs. These freaks were just like the legends. They were immortal monsters. They knew no fatigue, no pain, no fear, no breathing. Could they win against a group of freaks like this? "Xian, we can't go on like this," shouted Ta. These freaks had the advantage in terms of numbers. They were definitely stronger than these freaks. However, if these freaks couldn't be killed, there was nothing they could do. They had chopped off their arms, legs, and even their heads, but they still caused trouble for them time and time again. Just now, one of their arms had attacked them from behind. Yes, it was just a single arm with a sharp spike in it. If Xiaofan hadn't warned them to be on guard against ambushes, many of them would have fallen victim to the attack. Who would have thought that they could still cause trouble in that situation? Could it be that he wanted to chop the bones of those freaks into pieces? That would be too tiring. They wanted to attack Su Lu, but the freaks kept them busy. There was no way they could get close. "Help me block the perimeter," Xiaofan said as he kicked the freak that lunged at him. He could even clearly hear the cracking of the freak's bones. His entire body was slightly deformed, but after landing heavily in the distance, he got up and ran towards them. This was only the beginning. If this continued, it would be disadvantageous to the Yanjiao people. When Ta, Tua, and the rest heard Xiaofan's words, they surrounded Xiaofan with a few other Yanjiao people nearby. They formed a circle around Xiaofan. Xiaofan took a deep breath and held his sword horizontally in front of him. His other hand brushed against the blade and his thumb was immediately cut open by the sharp blade. Blood flowed from the wound. What is he doing? Gongjiaren was confused. The rest of the Yanjiao people didn't understand either, but they just had to follow Xiaofan's instructions. The Grand Elder must have his reasons for doing so. Chapter 750. The Yanjiao people had strong healing abilities. Xiaofan's healing abilities were even stronger. However, he was controlling the wound on his finger to prevent it from healing too quickly. He pressed his fingertip harder on the blade, causing more blood to flow out from the wound. To prevent the blood from dripping onto the ground, Xiaofan pressed the wound on his thumb against the blade. His finger moved along with the blood flowing out, following the blade towards the tip. Tsk tsk, as Xiaofan's finger moved, the blade emitted a strange sound. It didn't sound like a finger moving on the smooth blade, but more like the sound of a scorching hot metal being branded onto something. Something's not right. What was that? Gongjiaren was puzzled. What made him even more puzzled was that the smooth blade had a trace of blood sticking to it as Xiaofan's finger moved. It didn't look like a random smear of blood. Blood wouldn't stick to the blade so tightly, but it was definitely blood. It was the blood left behind when Xiaofan cut his finger. Gongjiaren couldn't figure it out. Xiaofan didn't care about Gongjiaren's confusion. As the trace of blood neared the tip of the blade, he raised his hand and opened his palm. The totemic power within his body surged. At the same time, another surge of energy followed, as if a switch had been turned on. Within the totemic pattern, a white line danced, moving along his arm until it reached his open palm. Xiaofan felt a surge of heat flowing wildly on his arm, gathering towards his palm. Whoosh! Flames suddenly erupted from Xiaofan's raised palm, startling Gongjiaren and the rest who had been staring at him. What was going on? How could it burst into flames? Su Lu, who had been staring at Xiaofan, was also shocked. What was that Yanjiao doing? Also, what kind of metal weapon was that blade in Xiaofan's hand? Why hadn't he seen it before? It wasn't green either, but it definitely wasn't an ordinary metal weapon. What Sulu didn't notice was that the hooded man behind him shuddered the moment the flames emerged from Xiaofan's hands. It was as if he had seen something completely unexpected. Xiaofan, who was the center of everyone's attention, raised his flaming palm and slapped the tip of the knife where the blood had stopped. The moment Xiaofan's flaming palm came into contact with the blade, the blood stain on the blade was like a fuse that was ignited by the flames in Xiaofan's hand. The burning flame quickly spread throughout the blade. The flame rose up and almost enveloped the entire blade. It looked as if the blade had suddenly burst into flames. The moment the flame spread along the bloodstains and wrapped around the blade, it was as if there was an invisible heatwave that spread in all directions, revealing a majestic aura that shook people's hearts. The sandstorm created by the battle between the two giant beasts seemed to have been blocked by an invisible ball. Beneath their feet was the sand scorched by the scorching sun. At this time, the sun was scorching hot. In the past, Xiaofan and the others would have found a place to rest. But now, they were under the scorching sun and stepping on the scorching sand. The heat spread from their straw sandals to the soles of their feet. However, this heat wave seemed to be hotter than the sun's rays, or the sand that had been scorched by the sun. It was even hotter. Yet, this heat wave didn't make the Yanjiao people feel hot. Instead, it calmed their agitated hearts. The aura of the fire seed. Carefully sensing it, it was different from the fire seed's aura they were familiar with. Xiaofan was using the power of the fire seed? But even the fire seed couldn't ignite a metal weapon. The Yanjiao people weren't the only ones affected by the heat wave. Even the strange people covered in sackcloth paused for a moment under the heat. The hooded person sitting behind Sulu couldn't help but lean forward, as if trying to get a better understanding of the situation. However, Sulu didn't notice the reaction of the people behind him. He stared at the knife in Xiaofan's hand with a gloomy expression. Then, he sneered, "Although I don't know what he's doing, it's still futile. Does he think he can take care of these people with a flaming knife?" As he spoke, Sulu pulled his face forward and said in a low voice, "Kill him and snatch that knife for me." Murderous intent flashed in the eyes of the person behind Sulu. He directed the strange people to surround Xiaofan, ignoring the other Yanjiao people. He didn't listen to Suli's words. In fact, he didn't even hear what Sulu had said. He was only staring at Xiaofan. The only thought in his mind was to kill that person. The strange people who were originally fighting the Yanjiao people with missing arms and legs gave up on their opponents and rushed towards Xiaofan. "Dodge!" Xiaofan shouted at the Yanjiao people in front of him. The sound of a giant beast stomping on the ground rang out. The sand was sent flying high into the air. Those who didn't know what was going on would have thought that a giant beast had charged out from the sand. However, Sapphire and Suli's giant golden beasts were already fighting under the sand. They weren't here. The one who had caused the commotion was Xiaofan. Xiaofan's figure was no longer in his original position. All that was left was a large crater. The sand around the crater fell down, increasing the height of the surrounding area and making the crater even more obvious. Xiaofan's aura was like that of an excited beast. The sudden explosion of his aura was filled with the usual Yanjiao tyranny. The blood in his body seemed to be on fire. His muscles and bones rumbled under the stimulation of his totemic power. His entire body was charging toward Sulu in a straight line. Even though he was still far away, Sulu felt a suffocating sensation in his chest. It was as if someone had covered his mouth and nose. This was a form of suppression. Xiaofan had locked onto Suli's position. It made Sulu feel like he wasn't facing a human, but a ferocious beast. It was as if a tsunami was crashing down on him. Xiao Xian's target was Su Lu. If he wanted to break out of this situation and solve the crisis brought about by the monsters, the first thing he had to do was to get rid of the person who was controlling everything. The solution was a method Xiao Xian came up with after experimenting with the methods of controlling the monsters. The power that controlled the monsters was similar to a fire seed. This power existed within the monsters' bones. Because of this, the monsters without organs could still move even if they were cut in half or even if they lost their heads. As long as the power within the monsters' bones was affected, the control over them would be disrupted or even severed. When a monster charged towards him, Xiao Xian didn't slow down at all. After blocking the monster's attack, he rammed into the monster's arm. It was a brutal charge that was reminiscent of a wild beast in the forest. In terms of physical strength, these monsters couldn't compare to the totemic warriors of the Yanjiao tribe. What's more, Xiao Xian was a high-level totemic warrior. Under the impact, the sound of bones breaking rang out like popcorn popping. The monsters that tried to surround Xiao Xian were knocked away by Xiao Xian. If it was a normal person, they would have loosened their grip on their weapons due to the pain and impact. However, these strange people were different. Their hands seemed to be glued to their weapons. Even if their arms were fractured and deformed, their fingers were still tightly gripping their weapons. They didn't feel any pain. It was as if they were being controlled by someone. It was as if a program was deeply embedded in their bodies, forcing their fingers to stick to their weapons. Even if their arms were chopped off, they would still hold on to their weapons. A flaming saber shadow flashed past, and a headless monster was cut in half at the waist. The upper body of the monster flew into the air, and the lower body slid along the sand for a while before falling to the ground. Gongjiaren looked at the monster's upper body that flew into the air and landed heavily on the ground. Unlike the monsters that were cut by the Yanjiao tribe, the monster that was cut in half by Xiao Xian was still burning. Although it wasn't much and the fire didn't last long, it was definitely there. What surprised Gongjiaren even more was that the monster's body that he thought would move again after being cut in half was spasming like it was having a spasm. His arms that had just been raised went limp again. Was this an effect? Gongjiaren couldn't help but widen his eyes. Behind Su Lu, the hooded man's face turned pale. The muscles on his face were twitching. He felt as if a scorching stream of fire was sweeping through every inch of his muscles, bones, skin, and flesh. It was as if someone had suddenly released a group of crazy ferocious beasts that were crazily and disorderly charging. His meridians, veins, bones, and even the blood in his blood vessels were screaming in pain. Stop him! Stop him! Su Lu began to panic as he yelled. The slaves were busy dealing with the black beetles. On Xiao Xian's path, the black beetles had cleared a path for him. The slaves who finally had a chance to catch their breath were powerless to stop Xiao Xian. They could only rely on the confused monsters. Ta and the rest also wanted to help Xiao Xian, but Xiao Xian was too fast. They couldn't keep up. Forget the Yanjiao people, even the other monsters who were surrounding them couldn't keep up. They didn't even have the time to follow Su Lu and the hooded man's wishes. Under the flaming blade, the monsters who were slashed fell to the ground as if they were sick. They spasmed on the ground like machines that had gone haywire. Even if they were standing, they were still shivering from the cold. This scene was extremely strange to the crowd. Why were the monsters who were supposed to be unaffected by the attack acting as if they were sick? Only the hooded man knew that it was because he could no longer control the puppet slaves accurately. There was a force on their bodies that followed the cut left by the flaming blade and spread throughout the puppet slaves' bodies, interfering with his control. It even directly affected the bodies around him that he was controlling. It was the power of the fire seed. It was the power of the Yanjiao fire seed. The power he exerted on the monsters to control them was unstoppable. How could the Yanjiao people have such power? How? How could this be? Aren't those people supposed to be immortal? Su Li's tone changed drastically as he watched Xiaofan get closer and closer. The hooded figure began to tremble uncontrollably. At this point, it was impossible for Su Li not to notice. "What's wrong with you?" Su Li asked anxiously. This person was his shield. If something happened to him, he and his slaves were no match for the Yanjiao people. Besides, the Yanjiao people were related to the insect swarm. Who is that person?" The hooded man's voice trembled, as if he was trying to suppress a great pain. His expressionless face twitched as beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. His appearance scared Su Li. It was obvious that something was wrong with this person, and it was a big problem. Who was Xiaofan? "He's a Yanjiao person, from the Yanjiao tribe." Su Li stuttered. The hooded man obviously wasn't asking about this. He knew that the person was a Yanjiao person, but what was his status in Yanjiao? Why did he have such power? He could feel that not only was his connection with the puppet slaves being disrupted, but it was also being severed one by one. Every time a connection was severed, it felt like a meridian in his body was being severed. The pain was unbearable. His connection with the puppet slaves was much closer than Su Li's connection with his slaves. After all, he was the one who controlled the puppet slaves' every move. He had absolute control over them. On the other hand, the loss of this connection meant that the backlash was even more severe. Why? Why is this happening? Who is he? The hooded man mumbled. His grayish-white eyes stared at the person who was charging towards him. His eyes were filled with fear as he stared at the fiery light that was moving so fast it was hard to follow. "Go!" the hooded man growled. "WH. What?" Su Li stared at the hooded man in disbelief. Go? Was this a failure? Why else would he choose to retreat? Go! The hooded man raised his voice, as if he was using all his strength to shout. Seeing that Xiaofan was about to attack, Su Li gritted his teeth and whistled. He reached out and scooped up the person behind him. He didn't dare to leave this person behind and escape alone. Otherwise, he would be punished by Su Luan when he returned. With the hooded man in tow, Su Lu rushed out of the tent shack and retreated hastily. As for the remaining slaves and monsters, they were abandoned. It wasn't easy for the two of them to leave, so they couldn't bring those people with them. Although Su Lu felt pity for the slaves, they were nothing compared to his own life. Under such circumstances, he had no choice but to abandon them. Besides, he still needed them to hold off the Yanjiao people and buy them time to leave. Behind Su Lu, there was a loud bang from the sand. The giant golden-armored beast emerged from the sand with its front body upright and its dozens of legs spread out. When Su Lu and the hooded man arrived, the beast wrapped its legs around each other to form a small, narrow space, protecting Su Lu and the hooded man inside. As for the giant golden-armored beast, its entire body began to curl inwards from its head, protecting the head and the hooded man inside. In the end, it formed a large, golden ball. The parts that were exposed outside were the sturdiest parts of its body. The giant golden-armored beast wasn't considered to be the type with strong offensive capabilities. It specialized in defense. Back then, Su Gu and Su Lu had chosen this giant beast because of its strong defensive capabilities. In times of crisis, it could form a sturdy protective barrier, protecting them securely inside. Even the sharp fangs and claws of the desert's famous beasts couldn't easily break through the giant golden-armored beast's hard shell. This was the type of beast that could save their lives. The giant golden-armored beast's curled body formed a round ball. The rings of hard shell were tightly connected to each other. There were only a few small gaps that even small beetles couldn't squeeze through. These gaps were for the people inside to breathe easily. The giant golden ball rolled on the sand, kicking up sand that shot out at high speed. It was like the muddy water kicked up by the tires of a car as it rolled across a muddy beach. Xiaofan avoided the high-speed sand and slashed at the giant golden ball. His blade carried a trail of flames as it collided with the giant golden ball. Screech! The ear-piercing sound of metal being cut was accompanied by sparks. A long, black scar appeared on the giant golden armored beast's body, as if it had been burned. The scar was as deep as a palm. As the giant golden ball rolled, the black scar expanded to half a circle in the blink of an eye. 2 more slashes and the giant golden armored beast's hard shell would have been cut open. Even though Xiaofan's attack didn't break through its defense, it was enough to make the golden armored beast panic. It sped up again, desperately fleeing into the distance. Xiaofan landed on the ground. His blade-wielding arms were numb from the impact of the slash on the giant golden armored beast's body. The web between his thumb and forefinger was cracked. He wanted to chase after the giant golden armored beast and finish it off, but the beast's defense was too strong. It would take some time to finish it off. However, there were still many weirdos to deal with. Xiaofan couldn't just abandon the Yanjiao group. After all, they didn't have a flaming blade. Not everyone had a special ability like Xiaofan. Bang! A blue figure rushed out from the sand. Sapphire was in the midst of an intense battle with the golden armored beast when it suddenly ran towards the sand. It rushed out of the sand and looked around. 2 paddle-shaped antennae vibrated, and it moved its 6 long legs to chase after the golden armored beast. Seeing Sapphire give chase, Xiaofan temporarily retreated to deal with the remaining weirdos. Even if the person in charge of controlling the golden armored beast had left, as long as they didn't exceed the effective range, the weirdos would still be a threat. However, as the controller moved further away, their movements would become more sluggish. Chapter 751. In the desert, a team of 200 people was walking slowly on the sand, as if they were taking a leisurely stroll. However, the atmosphere in the team was not the same. A short and stout man looked anxious. From time to time, he would glance at the back of the giant golden beast, waiting for the person above to speak. The sound of footsteps around him seemed to be filtered out. His ears were only waiting for the person behind the curtain to speak. Unfortunately, the silence had been going on for a while. The short and stout man could only wait anxiously. He wiped the sweat off his forehead, took out a water bag made of sea fish skin, and gulped down 2 mouthfuls of water. The water in the water bag was already very hot from the scorching sun. He felt as if his organs were being roasted the moment he gulped it down. It was mostly a psychological factor that caused him to feel this way. With his strength, the water temperature was nothing, but now was the time to be anxious. Even the slightest bit of heat could make him anxious. This man was called Tu Su. He was once a slave master of low status in White Stone City. He had trained a few desert insects, which he learned from some tribesmen. Back then, the people of the Wuxia tribe had similar techniques. He then combined the techniques of other tribes and created a unique technique to control insects that was suitable for himself. He could use the insects to understand what was happening in places where his eyes could not see. Previously, Tu Su knew that Su Li's team had encountered the Yanjiao because of this technique. However, most of the time, he knew what was happening over there from the sounds, so he could not see clearly. However, just the sound alone was enough to make it easier for Su Gu to grasp the situation. It was also for this reason that Su Gu protected this person during the battle in the desert. Although Tu Su's combat strength was almost useless, Su Gu only valued his ability to control insects. Tu Su had already told Su Lu about what happened over there. Although he did not know the details, it was true that Su Li's team had been defeated and fled. Previously, Tu Su was still puzzled as to why Su Gu ordered the team, which had already slowed down, to slow down even more once he knew that there were Yanjiao soldiers there, and that their leader was called Xiaofan. He even took a few breaks along the way. Now, Tu Su was utterly impressed by Su Gu. If Su Gu had not ordered the team to slow down, they would have definitely bumped into those Yinjiao soldiers by now. They might even have been implicated by Su Gu. Tu Su was so anxious that he was sweating profusely. On one hand, he was panicking after hearing the news. He was afraid that he would encounter the Yinjiao as well. After all, Su Gu's team composition was very similar to Su Li's. If Su Lu could only flee in defeat, how strong could Su Gu be? Secondly, after Su Gu learned of the news, he did not let the team change direction. He still maintained the original planned route. Even if they slowed down, if they kept going, would they encounter the Yinjiao people? Tu Su was perturbed. Tugging on the hat that was covering Yang Guang's face, Tu Su put the water skin away. Just as he was about to ask again, he suddenly heard a commotion in front of him. "What's that?" exclaimed the slave who was walking in front. "Young master, there seems to be." Tu Su paused and did not finish his sentence. He just stared ahead with wide eyes. At the intersection of the desert and the sky, a golden light flashed. Something was approaching quickly, bringing with it a lot of sand and dust. Tu Su was not unfamiliar with this scene. Su Gu had used a similar method before. A golden-plated beast. "Young master, it's a golden-plated beast," Tu Su exclaimed. He was already anxious because of the news. When he saw what was running in front of him, he already had a guess. Although there were other golden-plated beasts in the desert, it was rare to see a golden-plated beast curled up into a ball and fled across the desert. Moreover, Tu Su already knew that Su Li's team was escaping. Hence, the one in front of him could very well be Su Li's golden-plated beast. Su Gu could no longer sit still. He lifted the canopy in front of him and looked at the golden ball rolling towards him. When it got closer, Su Gu was sure that it was Su Li's golden-plated beast. They saw that there were many scratches on the golden ball. They knew how hard the golden-plated beast's shell was. To be able to leave so many scratches on the golden-plated beast's body, it was clear that the opponent was very difficult to deal with. Among them, the most obvious one was a burn mark that was drawn in a large circle. To be able to force the golden-plated beast into such a state, one could imagine the battle situation at that time. It was no wonder that Su Lu did not care about his well-trained slaves. As the golden-plated beast got closer and closer to Su Gu's team, it began to slow down. Although Su Lu and Su Gu were in a state of competition, and both wished for the other to die so that they could inherit Luoya City, under such circumstances, if Su Lu were to call for help, Su Gu would still have to lend a helping hand. This was because there was another person with Su Lu, and he dared not kill that person. However, it did not matter. After all, Su Lu had failed this time. When he returned, he would definitely be punished, and Su Gu would be able to get more resources. Just as Su Gu was thinking about what to do later, the golden ball had already rolled to the front of their team. The golden ball was about to open, but it quickly closed again and rolled to the side. The golden-plated beast under Su Gu's feet began to fret. Boom! The sand rushed up, and the slaves in front hurriedly avoided it. A large blue beetle rushed out from the sand and blocked the direction of the golden-armored beast. Then, with a kick of its two legs, it forcefully kicked the golden-armored beast into the air. The golden ball's rolling momentum was blocked. Not only was it blocked, but it was also kicked in the opposite direction. As a result, a scene like this appeared on the sand. A large blue beetle was standing upside down, using its two hind legs to kick the golden ball in one direction. However, the golden ball did not want to roll in that direction. It tried its best to change direction, and for a moment, the rolling path was twisted and turned. Su Gu was speechless. What was going on? What was this blue beetle that suddenly rushed out? Young master. That big beetle is with the Yinjiao people. The insect tide might be brought by it. Tu Su was so scared that his back was covered in sweat. He hurriedly shouted to Su Gu. The moment they heard about the insect tide, Su Gu's slaves trembled. They did not want to stay and feed the insects. Su Gu did not want to stay either. He originally planned to delay until the Yanjiao people left, then he would go to the scene of the incident. Now, it seemed that it was impossible. Retreat. Leave this place immediately. After Su Gu shouted, he looked at the person sitting behind him. He was also wearing a hood. Like the people around Su Lu, he was usually very cold. After Su Gu shouted for them to retreat, that person did not object. In fact, he also wanted to go and see how the puppet slaves were doing, but the situation had changed. They should leave first. Are the Yanjiao people here too? Su Gu asked Tu Su anxiously. Tu Su was about to answer when he suddenly felt his vision go black. His head felt like it was covered by a copper bell and someone was knocking on it from the outside. It felt like it was going to explode. Tu Su knew this feeling very well. It was because the connection between him and the two winged insects he sent out had been severed. Those winged insects were equivalent to his slaves. There was only one way to sever the connection between him and the winged insects, and that was if the winged insects had died. On the other side, a group of black beetles spread their wings and flew towards the inconspicuous flying insect. The flying insect flew faster than the beetles, but it had lost the opportunity to escape. As more and more beetles surrounded it, its wings were finally bitten. Then, a second, a third, and even more beetles surrounded the flying insect and ate it. On the ground, the black insect tide devoured all the golden-armored slaves. Some of the slaves tried to escape, but they were cut down by the Yanjiao people and swallowed by the insect tide. The Yanjiao people tried their best to control the strange people and let Xiaofan finish them off. This was faster, but they did not get close to the strange people. Almost every bone in the strange people's body could be a lethal weapon. The most they could do was break the bones and slow down their movements. As Su Lu distanced himself from the monster's controller, the monsters were no longer as agile as they were at the start of the battle. Truth be told, if they were separated by such a long distance, the effect would not have been so obvious. However, the hooded figure had suffered from the backlash and his control over the puppet slaves had weakened significantly. A flaming blade plunged into the chest of a strange person. The strange person pinned to the ground twitched and crackled like firewood being burned. Soon, the strange person would fall to the ground, motionless. That was when the strange people would truly die. Under the impact of the two forces, the bones in the strange people's bodies had changed. If one were to dissect the bones, one would find that there was only some grayish-white powder left in the bones. It looked like the ashes left behind by burning plants. This kind of destruction was irreversible. In other words, they could no longer be controlled and would soon rot, just like those who had truly died. After all the strange people were dealt with, Xiaofan checked them one by one. After confirming that there were no longer any threats, the Yanjiao people heaved a sigh of relief. After letting the others check on the injured, Xiaofan walked towards the small house that Su Lu had left behind. The small house was surrounded by black beetles. The other Yanjiao people did not dare to approach. Only Xiaofan would not be attacked by these beetles. When he approached, the beetles would even make way for him. When Su Lu escaped, he did not have time to take anything else with him. In the small house surrounded by curtains, there were 2 wide lounge chairs, a low table, and a few bottles and jars filled with water and food. 2 jars with wide openings were filled with fruits. They looked fresh and juicy. In this kind of weather, who knew how many days they had walked in the desert? It was almost impossible for the fruits to remain fresh unless there was something special that kept them fresh. Xiaofan found some egg-sized brownish-yellow stones in the jars that held the fruits and food. These stones were not very hard and Xiaofan could crush them with just a little force. Every jar that contained food had such a stone. Obviously, this kind of stone was the reason why the food was fresh for a long time. Chapter 752. Xiaofan didn't look at the rocks for long. He flipped through Su Li's recliner. There was a hidden compartment under the recliner, but there were only some pretty gemstones inside. Su Li might have taken away the important items. Xiaofan stepped over the recliner and came to the recliner behind it. This was where the person controlling the strange man sat. There was another hidden compartment under the recliner. There were no gemstones inside, only a few bottles. Xiaofan took a sniff. There were 8 bottles. 4 of them were probably used for healing or other purposes, so they shouldn't be poisonous. The other 4 gave Xiaofan a bad feeling. They might be poison or something else. Judging from the traces in the hidden compartment, there should have been 10 bottles inside. 2 of them had been taken away, perhaps by the person before they escaped. Xiaofan removed the hidden compartment and put it aside. He walked around the small house and changed his vision. He scanned the interior of the house. There were no other hidden compartments, but there was another level below the house. In Xiaofan's vision, there was another person below. He could only see the skeleton, so he didn't know what the person looked like. However, Xiaofan became alert when he saw the skeleton below. The human skeleton was very bright in Xiaofan's vision. There was a qualitative difference between the bones of strong and weak people. In Xiaofan's special vision, the bones of strong people were brighter. The bones below were even brighter than those of Ao and Zheng Luo. Xiaofan had never seen such bright bones on a human before. The flame on his saber that had just been extinguished reignited. Xiaofan couldn't help but be cautious. He didn't sense the presence of a living person, nor did he sense any other energy waves. He thought that the strange man was no longer here, but who was the one below? Xiaofan leaped out of the house. He raised his arm and slashed at the side of the house close to the ground. He could see the situation inside through the gap. There was a long wooden box inside. It looked like a coffin. The person was inside. There was still no movement. There was a long gap at the bottom of the hut, and the beetles didn't crawl in. The hut seemed to have been sprinkled with medicine, which had the effect of repelling beetles, so the beetles didn't come close. Xiaofan looked inside for a while, then walked over and pulled out the coffin with his free hand. Strangely enough, the beetles avoided the coffin. They didn't even get close to it. After Xiaofan dragged the coffin out and put it on the ground, the surrounding beetles avoided it. Could it be that this coffin was also sprayed with insecticide? Xian, what's that? Tower and the others did not dare to get close because of the insect horde. They could only watch from afar. Seeing Xiaofan drag something out from under the hut, the others were also curious. I don't know, Xiaofan said as he used the tip of his knife to pry open the lid. Inside was a shriveled person. His skin was greenish-black, and his clothes looked strange. They were very simple and tattered. The accessories looked like they had been there for a long time. They would break with a pinch, and it was impossible to tell what they originally looked like. Judging from the clothes and accessories, this corpse should have been left here for a long time. However, this corpse looked similar to the other monsters that had been controlled. Its entire body was shriveled, and there were clear traces of ribs. Its abdomen was sunken, but there were no signs of it being torn open. The other monsters had signs of rupture because their organs were removed, but this one didn't. Was it because the people from Rock Hill City didn't have time to do it, or did they deliberately not do it? Or was there another reason? A hawk screeched outside. Xiaofan stopped looking at the person and closed the lid again. This kind of monster was not suitable for Yangguang. Otherwise, the controllers wouldn't have covered their bodies with thick cloth to hide Yangguang. Cha-Cha did not participate in the close combat. It had been watching from the sky to prevent others from approaching and attacking them. Now, Cha-Cha warned them again. This time, it was not an enemy attack, but Sapphire's return. Even without Cha-Cha's warning, Xiaofan could sense it. However, Sapphire looked miserable. Its forelimbs and hind legs were severely injured. One of its forelimbs was missing, and the other was not in good condition either. Its hind legs and forelimbs were in similar condition. There were many impact marks on its back. It was a smooth arc, but it looked like it had been smashed. Sapphire didn't look this bad when it came out of the sand and chased after the golden armored beast. Clearly, this was the result of its continued pursuit. When Sapphire returned, it was pushing a sand ball. It liked to roll its spoils into a ball and push it around. When Sapphire pushed the ball upside down, the sand ball was slightly taller than it. On the sand ball, there were two pieces of golden hard armor that shone brightly under the sun. They were two segments of hard armor from the golden armored beast's body. There was still flesh on them. They had been forcefully removed from the golden armored beast's body. Xiaofan shifted his gaze from the sand ball to Sapphire, who was already in front of him. Upon closer inspection, Xiaofan noticed that Sapphire's shovel-like head was slightly crooked. Its two paddle-shaped antennae drooped down like folded antennae. When Sapphire chased after the golden armored beast, Xiaofan didn't let it fight to the death. He didn't expect Sapphire to pursue to this extent. Sapphire seemed to be in a hurry to explain something. Due to the connection between their consciousnesses, Xiaofan could roughly guess why it couldn't bring Su Lu and the controller here. Su Lu and the others had reinforcements. Otherwise, Sapphire wouldn't have ended up in such a sorry state. Sapphire rolled the sand ball in front of Xiaofan, indicating that it wanted Xiaofan to examine its results. Its two folded antennae swayed anxiously and nervously. Seeing Sapphire's reaction, Xiaofan smiled. He cut open the sand ball with his saber and dug out two pieces of shiny, ring-shaped hard armor from the sand ball. There was no one inside, but there were two small bottles. Xiaofan guessed that they were together with the 8 bottles he found in the hidden compartment of the hut. Perhaps they were dropped when Sapphire was chasing after them. The opening of the bottle was tightly sealed. Xiaofan examined it. The bottle wasn't broken. The medicine inside had a refreshing smell that refreshed one's spirit. It was probably a healing medicine. Other than these, Xiaofan also dug out a palm-sized green metal plate from the sandball. There were words engraved on it, the number 22 foot. Putting aside the meaning of this number, the palm-sized metal plate in Xiaofan's hand was similar to Yanjiao's new bronze. It was probably made from the blood of a green-faced fanged beast that the people of Rock Hill City had captured. However, its quality was slightly better than that of Yanjiao's and it was also more exquisite. Looking at the nervous giant blue beetle in front of him, Xiaofan asked, "Do you want to unlock the last lock?" Sapphire's two antennae shook. The folded section seemed to lift up, and its hind legs that were missing a section kicked the sand. It was agitated. Xiaofan didn't intend to unlock the 5th lock so soon. Sapphire had just woken up not long after the 4th lock was unlocked. Unlocking the 5th lock so soon would be risky. Secondly, Xiaofan thought about it the most. The more slaves he unlocked, the stronger he would become. Many slaves who broke free from their shackles relied on their talents and willpower after unlocking the 2nd and 3rd locks. Sapphire's body was different from the other slaves with 3 locks. When Xiaofan enslaved it, he placed 5 locks on it. So far, he had already unlocked 4. Xiaofan didn't know if the giant blue beetle would break free from his control after unlocking the 5th lock. It might even break free from his enslavement. However, he didn't know when he would return after leaving the desert this time. Would the injured Sapphire be targeted by the people of Rock Hill City? What would happen when that happened? Xiao Xian couldn't predict it. He didn't manage to capture Su Li's men this time. With Su Li's vengeful personality, he would definitely do everything in his power to seek revenge. Yanjiao was too far away from the desert. The possibility of Su Lu leaving the desert wasn't high. Thus, he could only target Sapphire. The insect swarm was too big a target. It wasn't impossible for Su Lu to find Sapphire. He could even set up some traps to lure the swarm. There were many factors to consider. If he wasn't careful, the knife in his hand could become a tool to stab himself. However, Sapphire's performance this time made Xiao Xian decide to unlock the fifth lock. Ji Ju once said that the loyalty of the first slave was much higher than that of the other slaves. Xiao Xian was willing to take a gamble. Even if Sapphire really broke free in the future, it wouldn't turn against Xiao Xian. Other than Sapphire, Xiao Xian also noticed during this trip to the desert that Sapphire was faintly influencing the other beetles that followed it. There were changes in the swarm. Some beetles were larger than the others. When Sapphire was in hibernation, these beetles led the swarm to sweep the desert. Every time they swept, beetles would die and new beetles would join them. The swarm had expanded compared to before. However, based on the conditions here, the number of beetles in the swarm would eventually fluctuate within a certain range. If there were too many beetles, they wouldn't be able to survive with limited food. However, the future of the swarm still depended on Sapphire. A swarm with a leader was completely different from a swarm without one. A swarm with a leader knew how to coordinate strategically, while a swarm without a leader would be more disorganized and wouldn't survive for long. "I wonder what you'll look like after you're fully unlocked," muttered Xiao Xian as he watched the giant beetle kick its legs excitedly. After the swarm of insects retreated, the Yanjiao people removed the armor from the slaves that had been beaten to the bone. In Gongjia Ren's words, these were good materials for forging. The 2 pieces of golden armor that Sapphire brought back were also taken away by the Yanjiao people. Xiao Xian carried the coffin-like wooden box, planning to study it when he got back. The group didn't stay for long. After a short rest, they left in case the people from Rock Hill City came. When they were about to reach the edge of the desert, Xiao Xian unlocked the 5th lock for Sapphire. Perhaps after unlocking all the locks, Sapphire could become a king beast like other fearsome beasts. Chapter 753. After unlocking the 5th lock, Sapphire burrowed into the depths of the sand and fell into a deep slumber. Xiao Xian didn't know when Sapphire would be able to complete this phase. If everything went well, Sapphire would grow stronger and recover from its injuries. Every time Sapphire woke up from its slumber after unlocking the lock, it would undergo such changes. However, if things didn't go well, not only would Sapphire's injuries be unable to heal, but there would also be negative side effects. The Yanjiao tribe was quite a distance away from the desert. Even if something went wrong, Xiao Xian wouldn't be able to arrive in time. Sapphire could only rely on itself. They didn't encounter many Rock Hill City people along the way. The ones they did encounter were small squads, probably patrolling. When they saw the Yanjiao team, they didn't initiate an attack. Those troops were made up of normal slaves and not monsters. Now that the desert was far away from Rock Hill City's territory, it was rare to see those monsters. Perhaps it was because of the war at the seaside that all of them were transferred there. Hence, Xiao Xian's team didn't encounter much trouble after Su Lu. They traveled at night and found a place to rest during the day when it was hot. They were wearing the golden armor they stripped from Su Li's slaves. Before Sapphire was unlocked, it was only used as a porter. After that, the Yanjiao people carried it themselves. The weight of the golden armor was nothing to them. They could even carry it on their backs to hunt sand beasts. Although the armor was indeed useful, wearing it restricted one's movements and one could not get used to it. That was why the Flaming Horns decided to take these armors back and melt them down for recasting. Perhaps they could even make a few decent weapons. We're finally leaving this godforsaken place, Tower said as he looked ahead. Cha-Cha had already flown out of the desert to find the Yinjiao people waiting outside. They would come to their aid. The sandstorm rose again, blurring their vision. However, they could still sense the approaching Yinjiao people. Boss! Grand Elder! Someone ran over. Did it go well? Oh, did you rob them? The person who came over took the armor. This type of equipment was obviously used by the slaves in the desert. I ran into some trouble along the way. After I've solved it, I'll take it back with me, Tower said simply. Looking at the strangers in the group, the receptionist asked, are they the Gongjia family? Yes, that's them. Once they were out of the desert, Ta's mood lightened. He introduced the 6 Gongjia members to the people who were waiting for them. To make it easier for them to understand, Ta used the language of the other side of the sea. Although it wasn't fluent, at least they could understand. The helper looked at the coffin-like thing Xiao Xian was carrying. He wanted to help Xiao Xian carry it, but Xiao Xian refused. Xiao Xian wasn't sure if this thing was dangerous, so it was better for him to carry it. At least if the person in the coffin was really being controlled, he would be able to detect the energy fluctuations immediately. If it was someone else, it might not be the same. The helper didn't ask any more questions. After receiving them, they wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. Now that their mission was complete, they had to hurry back. They couldn't get used to this place. They felt uncomfortable just waiting outside the desert, let alone those who had entered the desert. Let's go back. Tower and the rest didn't want to stay here for a moment longer. Although they were exhausted from rushing through the desert, they still pushed on. Weeds gradually grew on the sand. They were no longer surrounded by yellow sand. The greenery made their surroundings feel more alive. Not just the Yinjiao people, even the Gongjia members felt like they had been reborn. The desert was a nightmare and they almost couldn't escape from it. Fortunately, it was all over now. Arriving at a new place, everything was new to the 6 Gongjia members. The air was unfamiliar. The area where the tribesmen lived was very different from where they came from. On the other side of the sea, there were many people coming and going. Therefore, there were often small trails near the cities. Here, however, there were very few people. There were a lot of forests and some areas with poor soil were completely devoid of people. Only flocks of wild birds could be seen flying around. There weren't many caravans coming and going here. Occasionally, they would see some small traveling teams. Many people were still holding stone tools and horns. Their clothes weren't that exquisite, and they didn't even have gems. Their values were different, so naturally, their accessories were different. When they saw the Yinjiao people, these teams looked nervous. Some of them wanted to rob the Yinjiao people when they saw the gold weapons they were carrying. In the end, they failed and were robbed instead. Later on, to avoid unnecessary trouble, the Yinjiao people used some vines and leaves to weave baskets. They hid the gold armors in the baskets and carried them on their backs. Although they weren't afraid of robbers, they didn't want to waste time on these things. The 6 Gongjia members followed the team and continued forward. They felt much more at ease. It seemed that the tribesmen here weren't much different from what they had imagined. Especially the small tribesmen who lived in remote areas. They were still wearing clothes made from plant fibers. Their hair was unkempt, probably stained from searching for food in the forest. Their eyes were vigilant as they watched the Yinjiao team passing by. If the Yinjiao people hadn't told Gongjiaran that these were just small tribesmen, he would have thought they were slaves. Don't underestimate the small tribesmen. There must be a reason why they're still alive. Xiao Xian warned the 6 Gongjia members. The small tribesmen might be behind in terms of material resources, but they might not lose to them in terms of survival. If they were thrown into the desert with the Gongjia members, they would definitely live longer than them. In fact, the Yinjiao tribes weren't much better off than these small tribesmen. When did the tribes start to change? Ta thought about it. It seemed like after Xiao Xian brought them across the river, the change in the tribe was out of control. After witnessing the scene on the road, Gongjiaoren and the rest couldn't help but wonder what the Yinjiao tribes were like. What the Yinjiao people described in the desert, were they telling the truth? The surrounding forest was getting denser and denser, and more people were coming and going. Those people were more particular about their clothes, and their clothes and tools were more complicated. When a road opened up in the forest, the 6 Gongjia members were informed that they were approaching the Flaming River trading point. Gongjiaoren understood that there were similar roads near the cities on the other side of the sea. When the traveling teams saw the Yinjiao people, they automatically stepped aside to make way for the Yinjiao people. In fact, this road was wide enough for 2 teams to walk side by side. However, this place had already entered the area of influence of the Flaming Horns tribe. The strong were respected, so they took the initiative to give way, showing a weak attitude. Stepping onto a stone path, the 6 Gongjia members looked at the stone ground beneath their feet and clicked their tongues in wonder. There were no signs of stones joining together. The stone path beneath their feet was a single piece. There were also some petrified flowers and trees near the path. Even the fine thorns on the leaves were clear as day. This is the stone path made by the king beast? Asked Gongjiaoren. Yes, this is it. Other than the king beast, who else could make something like this? Answered Ta. After receiving confirmation, Gongjiaoren was in disbelief. How dare the Yinjiao tribes live here? If they lived on the other side of the sea, they would have evacuated the moment they heard of the king beast. Who would dare to live here like the Yinjiao? What? What is that? Gongjia Kan, who was beside Gongjiaoren, lifted his head and looked into the distance. Through the branches, he saw a towering building with a flag-like object fluttering at the top. It was a flaming horn totem. That's the Flaming River Tower, the tallest place in the Flaming River trading point. That's our trading point. The Yinjiao people spoke with pride. Is it really like the city? Exclaimed Gongjiaoren, looking at the building. As they got closer, the trading point finally appeared before them. Everyone, welcome to the Yinjiao tribe. Chapter 754. The 6 Gongjia members were led around the streets of the trading point to familiarize themselves with the place. Although the scale of the trading point could not be compared to the famous cities on the other side of the sea, it was still much better than the smaller cities that were built later on. It was clear that the Yinjiao people had put in a lot of effort to build this trading point. However, this was not the end of the Flaming River trading point. According to the Yinjiao people, they would continue to expand. Now that the land had been fenced, it was hard to say how big the trading point would be. Even though it was similar to a city, the environment here was obviously different from the other side of the sea. The shops here were not complicated and there were not many types of products. It was obvious that they were built in a tribal style. Other than the resting inns, the shops selling fearsome beast meat, horns and fangs were the most crowded places. The place was filled with a more primitive and wild atmosphere. This is unbelievable. I can't believe it's like this, exclaimed the oldest of the 6, Gongjia Kansas. Although the Yinjiao people had introduced them to the trading point on the way here, they were still shocked when they saw it for themselves. It really was different from the rumors. Looks like we made the right choice, sighed Gongjiaoren. The others nodded in agreement. This place was much better than they had imagined. They were willing to start a new life in a place like this. They don't have a unified currency here. That's right, metal wares are rare here so they barter with other things. Gongjia can observe their surroundings carefully. One of the Yinjiao warriors couldn't help but say, actually, the Grand Elder has the idea of a unified currency but he hasn't implemented it yet due to certain reasons. Oh? Gongjia Ren's interest was piqued. He asked, then did the Grand Elder mention anything about the currency? Shells? Animal bones? Or animal fangs? The Yanjiao warrior kept quiet. Before the Grand Elder made the decision, they would not reveal too much. Gongjia Ren could only give up. These Yanjiao people were very stubborn. If they did not want to talk, it would be hard to pry them out of them. However, Gongjia Ren kept this question to himself. While Gongjia Ren and the rest were being led around the trading point, Xiao Xian carried the coffin-like wooden box to the secret underground room. He wouldn't bring something that he wasn't sure if it was a threat to the headquarters, so he could only leave it here. This is very similar to the monsters in the desert, Zheng Luo said after opening the lid and taking a look. Similar but different. Zheng Luo remembered what the weirdo from the Hui tribe looked like. Although this one was similar to those shriveled weirdos, there were many differences. Are they complete? Zheng Luo asked. Although the person inside was shriveled, there were no wounds on his body. His abdomen was deeply sunken, but unlike those strange people who only had a layer of flesh and bones left, there were still things inside. Perhaps they were shriveled organs. Just like the shriveled flesh on this person's body, those organs might also be shriveled up. He hasn't been controlled yet? Or is there another reason? Zheng Luo was puzzled. According to what you said, there must be a reason why the slave owner brought him along. I think it's because the person who controlled the weirdos couldn't control this one. Xiao Xian wouldn't bring this corpse into the trading point without any clues. He had tested it several times on the way here. This person must have been strong when he was alive, no weaker than you and Ao. His bones are very hard. You know, for Yanjiao's totemic warriors, the stronger they are, the harder their bones are. Of course, Zheng Luo knew this. If a beginner totemic warrior and an advanced totemic warrior hit a stone of the same quality, the former would be injured but the latter would be able to shatter the stone directly. Increasing one's strength would strengthen one's body and bones would be a part of it. This person's bones were very hard. Even if he wasn't outstanding in other aspects when he was alive, just the toughness of his bones was enough to measure his strength. This person must have been dead for a long time. Xiao Xian pinched the unrecognizable ornaments on the corpse's body. With just a little force, a cracking sound could be heard. These ornaments should have been very hard when they were made, just like the bones and teeth of the fearsome beasts we use. It's just that some other things happened and a long time has passed, so they've become fragile. Even so, they're still harder than the bones of normal beasts, Xiao Xian explained. Zheng Luo understood what Xiao Xian was trying to say. These ornaments were probably made from fearsome beasts' bones and were very hard when they were first made. In other words, those fearsome beasts were not easy to deal with. How could the people who hunted them be weak? Yes, different species of fearsome beasts had different degrees of hardness. Perhaps a weaker fearsome beast had tougher bones, but Zheng Luo and Xiao Xian believed in their guesses. They were also a tribe that focused on hunting, so they understood how tribesmen thought. As for ornaments, they preferred the more dangerous and aggressive fearsome beasts. That was the best way to show off their strength and status. The people of Rock Hill City liked to find strong totemic warriors or slaves to make into strange puppets. This one might be one of their targets, but this one is different from the others. Xiao Xian pointed at the person lying in the box. There's some residual power in his bones, similar to the power of the monsters we met in the desert. But it's too little. It can't even control a small piece of bone, let alone a whole person. The residual power must have been left behind by the people of Rock Hill City when they tried to control it. They failed, so they left it until now. Ever since they left the desert, Xiao Xian had not sensed any signs of life from this wooden box. This person should be dead. But how could a lifeless corpse that was not frozen, treated with medicine, or controlled by other forces be preserved in such a state without rotting. Back then, the pterosaur and the other insects had been preserved for so long because they were frozen. So how did this corpse, which looked like it had been dead for a long time without rotting, stay in this state? He did not have the bone ornaments worn by Yanjiao's ancestors. Xiaoxian, have you tried to control it? Asked Zheng Luo. He knew that Xiaoxian could imitate the people of Rock Hill City and use a similar method to control a corpse. Xiaoxian shook his head. I tried once on the way back but it didn't work. But I was in a rush and had limited time so I didn't take it seriously. I'll try again after I settle the Gongjia people down. Zheng Luo also hoped that Xiaoxian could control this shriveled monster. If he succeeded, they would have another ally. Should we send someone to guard this place today? Asked Zheng Luo. Xiaoxian was going to bring the 6 Gongjia people to the headquarters so he couldn't stay here forever. When Xiaoxian left, they still had to send someone to guard this place just in case. Do you want me to do it myself? Asked Zheng Luo. No, no need. I have someone more suitable. Seeing that Xiaoxian had rejected his suggestion, Zheng Luo was curious about who Xiaoxian was referring to. Xiaoxian opened the door to the secret room and walked out to wait for a while. Someone came over. It was the guard at the top of the flaming river tower. The pterosaur was perched on his shoulder. You've gained weight. Xiaoxian compared the pterosaur's appearance before he left to its current appearance. This pterosaur had been living a carefree life while he was gone. Xiaoxian could now control the pterosaur at the headquarters. Although it wasn't as precise as when he was close to the headquarters, it was enough to make the pterosaur fly over obediently. No matter how impudent the pterosaur usually was in front of the Yanjiao people, it was very obedient now. It raised its head to look at Xiaoxian, then lowered its head as if it didn't dare to approach. A while ago, when Xiaoxian wasn't around, the pterosaur couldn't be controlled due to the distance. Every day, the pterosaur would lead the group of ill-trained bitter leaf birds to steal food from the patrolling soldiers. It would even throw fish bones at them. However, everyone knew that this pterosaur belonged to Xiaoxian. The 2 retired shamans also valued the pterosaur, so no matter how angry they were, they couldn't do anything to the pterosaur. All they could do was scold it. At first, it was useful. Later on, they used words to scare it. Forget about the pterosaur, it didn't even care about the group of birds. Xiaoxian already knew this from the people on duty at the trading point. This is the one you said is more suitable? Zheng Luo looked at the chubby pterosaur in disbelief. What else could it do? It's more suitable than the others. Xiaoxian walked over and grabbed the pterosaur's wings. He carried the unwilling pterosaur into the secret room. He pointed at the cage that hadn't been used for a long time. You'll sleep here tonight. Chapter 755. The pterosaur thought it could finally see the light of day again. It had already gotten used to its new living environment after spending so much time outside. However, Xiaoxian threw it back into this quiet underground secret room. The pterosaur was traumatized by this underground secret room. It had woken up here. In other words, it was here that it was reborn. At the same time, it was also here that Xiaoxian controlled it. It could still vividly remember the fear it felt when every bone in its body lost control. The pterosaur knew it could not resist, so it had no choice but to accept its fate. It cried out a few times to vent its anger but immediately shut up when it saw Xiaoxian look over. After placing some food and water in the secret room, Xiaoxian and Zheng Luo walked out. The stone door to the secret room was also closed. It's very smart, said Zheng Luo. This was the truth. Even the patrolling warriors who were angered by the pterosaur had to admit this. The creature that looked like a bird was much smarter than most animals. It had a strong learning ability and knew how to avoid harm. It could see the situation clearly. Just like now, it did not want to be locked in this cramped underground secret room. However, it did not dare to resist, so it could only stay inside obediently without any resistance. It's because it's smart and sensitive to danger that I put it in here. Also, when I left the tribe a while ago, it was indeed restless. I have to punish it. It won't be able to leave for the next few days, said Xiaoxian. Knowing that Xiaoxian had a plan, Zheng Luo did not say anything else. He was still very much looking forward to Xiaoxian controlling the corpse. Although Zheng Luo did not go to the desert, he heard from the people who came back about the abilities of the monsters. It was indeed terrifying. Without Xiaoxian, the people who entered the desert might not have made it out alive. What do you plan to do with the Wuxia family? Asked Zheng Luo as they walked towards the top of the flaming river castle. On the way here, they said that as long as Yanjiao accepts them, they would be willing to forge weapons for us. Gongjiaren also said that forging was a part of their lives. They might not be willing to be idle. It's just a win-win situation. However, they also said that the core skills of forging will not be passed on to outsiders. Zheng Luo was a little disappointed to hear that the craftsmanship would not be taught to outsiders, but he could understand. He thought about it, as long as the Gongjia family made things for Yanjiao, that would be enough. Zheng Luo pointed at the knife in Xiaoxian's hand. Can you mass-produce this kind of metal weapon? With the materials we have now, we can only make about 100 of them, Xiaoxian said. We've already replenished them with new crystals. It will take time to make more. Zheng Luo nodded. 100 was a lot. It was better than he had expected. If these metal weapons were easier to use, new bronze would gradually be replaced. However, truly being replaced was also a relatively long process. It was still too early to think about that now. The material used to forge Xiaoxian's knife was produced from crystals. To distinguish it from other metal weapons, they called it crystal gold. However, the existence of crystal gold was not made public by the Yanjiao tribe. Not many people even knew about it. After leaving the Flaming River Castle, Xiaoxian brought the 6 Gongjia members who had toured the trading point to the headquarters. The great bridge of the Flaming River that looked like it was floating on the surface of the water shocked the 6 Gongjia members once again. They even thought that if there was such a bridge between the 2 continents, they could bypass the battlefield and travel between the 2 continents. However, on second thought, it was good that there was no bridge. Since they had already left the other side, they might not be able to return even if they died. There was no need to keep thinking about the bridge. Freshman. Gongjiaren looked at the mountain in Yanjiao's headquarters. He could see the houses and people moving around on the mountain. The 6 Gongjia members did not raise a high profile when they entered Yanjiao's headquarters. They did not want to attract too much attention for the time being. Perhaps it was because they were on the run that they had developed a habit of keeping a low profile. Since the 6 Gongjia members agreed, Xiaoxian did not insist. He brought them to the place they wanted to visit the most, the forging room. After the cauldron explosion last time, in order to forge the knife in Xiaoxian's hand, they temporarily built a casting room dedicated to forging crystal gold. Although there were new types of gold, the Flaming Horn tribe still mainly used new bronze. A casting room for bronze had to be built, so a new casting room for bronze had to be built. Xiaoxian did not see it before he left. When he returned, he saw a new forging room that was about the same size as the previous one. The 6 Gongjia members discussed this with Xiaoxian. They hoped that Yanjiao could build a forging room for each of them. The Gongjia family's craftsmen would only gather together unless they were called by their masters to teach them skills or when they needed to work together. Most of the time, they liked to stay in their own place and study. Since they started learning how to forge, they spent more time in the forging room than in their bedrooms at home. They could not ask for too much in Yanjiao. Hence, they discussed with Xiaofan whether he could build 6 forging rooms for each of them. As for the houses, they did not need to build another one. They only needed to build a small house next to the forging room. They could make do with everything else, including living quarters. However, they could not make do with the forging room. Years of obsessive-compulsive disorder would not change in a short period of time. This was not a difficult task for Yinjiao. After all, this place was big enough. The forging rooms were built according to the design that the 6 of them were used to. With the 6 of them personally watching over the forging room, Xiaofan did not have to stay there all the time. After making arrangements for the 6 Gongjia members, Xiaofan returned to the mountain. He held a small meeting at the top of the mountain and briefly told the others about his trip. He also told them about the ancient corpse he brought back. Like Zheng Luo, the others also hoped that Xiaofan would be able to control a monster. That night, Xiaofan stayed at the headquarters and did not go to the Flaming River trading point. At night, in the secret underground chamber of the Flaming River Castle, the pterosaur, who was locked in the secret chamber, finished the beast meat that Xiaofan had left for him. It was bored, so it used its sharp claws to scratch the ground. Then, it looked at the long wooden box that Xiaofan had placed on the stone table. It flapped its wings and flew up to the stone table. Because the wooden box was damaged during the process of being transported here, there were gaps of varying sizes even when it was closed. After circling the wooden box, the pterosaur found a slightly bigger gap on the side and squeezed in. If it had just woken up not long ago, it would have been able to squeeze in. However, now that it had grown fatter, it was harder to squeeze in. It was stuck there. Using its mouth and claws, the pterosaur widened the gap and squeezed in with much difficulty. It did not like the smell inside, but it did not feel any signs of life. If it was a corpse that had just died not long ago, it would still eat it when it was hungry. However, the corpse in front of it had been dead for who knows how long. It did not have any appetite at all. Moreover, it had been spoiled during its time in the wild. It did not like the corpse in front of it at all. Instead, it stepped on the corpse and walked back and forth curiously. It pecked at the stones and bones that seemed to have been separated for a long time. After pecking an ornament into pieces, it stepped on the corpse's chest and walked up to the human face. The shriveled face no longer had its original appearance. The protruding cheekbones were more prominent, the eyes were sunken, and all the hair had fallen out. The pterosaur walked on the human face for a while and rummaged through the coffin-like wooden box. It did not find anything that interested it, so it came out from inside. It thought that Xiaofan would punish it severely. However, it did not expect that it would only be locked up here. There were no other creatures, so there was nothing to worry about. After circling the secret room again, the pterosaur flew back to the cage to sleep. It was active during the day. Its ability to move at night was not as strong as during the day, so it used it to rest. The next day, Xiaofan went to the trading point from the headquarters. When he opened the door to the secret room, the pterosaur was still sleeping in the cage. It only woke up when it heard the noise. When it saw the food in Xiaofan's hands, it was completely awake. At this time, it was not afraid of Xiaofan anymore. With a flap of its wings, the pterosaur glided from the cage to Xiaofan. Looking around, Xiaofan found that the secret room was not messed up except for the dragon feces. He threw the meat in his hand to the pterosaur and let it eat it. There were scratches and bite marks on the wooden box on the stone table. When he opened the lid, Xiaofan saw the ornaments that had been bitten. There were also some footprints on the ancient corpse. Xiaofan had sensed these last night and knew what the pterosaur had done last night. It was also because he knew that it did not destroy the ancient corpse that Xiaofan brought it food. While the pterosaur was gnawing on the food, Xiaofan planned to try to control the ancient corpse. At that time, the pterosaur was still alive, so Xiaofan did not make a move right away. Instead, he waited until the pterosaur had failed to resist. That was to increase the success rate. Now, Xiaoxian did not need to wait. It was even easier to enslave an inanimate object. However, with the failure on the way back, Xiaoxian was more careful this time. He did not need to worry about robbers jumping out from the surroundings, so he could concentrate more. Raising his hand, Xiaoxian drew out the power of the Yanjiao fire seed in his body. Similar to the pterosaur, he used the power of the Yanjiao fire seed to try to control it. Similarly, he did not completely separate the power of the Yanjiao fire seed from the other power in his body. He allowed them to be drawn out at the same time. This way, the success rate would be higher. With the appearance of the totem pattern, Xiaoxian raised his hand and a flame appeared. He reached his hand above the ancient corpse and slowly pressed it down. He did not know how long this ancient corpse had been stored, but the bones were very active. Otherwise, the people of Rock Hill City would not have brought it along. A corpse without any activity was useless to the people of Rock Hill City. They would have thrown it away long ago. However, since the people of Rock Hill City kept it, it proved that it had a higher value. Because of this, Xiaoxian planned to try a few more times. However, Xiaoxian soon realized that the situation was the same as before. The power of the fire seed could not penetrate deeply. The last time when Xiaoxian enslaved the pterosaur, he did not encounter any resistance. The flame carried the power of the fire seed and directly penetrated the pterosaur's skin and muscles, seeping into every bone. However, this time, Xiaoxian felt a repulsion. On the way back, when Xiaoxian failed, he also encountered a repulsion. However, because he had to take care of the surrounding situation, he could not continue. Xiaoxian did not stop. Instead, he increased the active power in his body and the flame in his hand grew bigger. The pterosaur had already abandoned its food and retreated to the corner when the flame appeared in Xiaoxian's hand. Now, it even tightened its wings, similar to how it was when it was frozen. Xiaoxian increased the power of the flame. When the flame penetrated the flesh, he could feel a clear resistance. It felt like he was going against a current. However, this was not the case. Every time the flame was about to penetrate the bones, it was as if it had encountered a hard shield and was strongly repelled. The more power the flame penetrated, the stronger the repelling force. After Xiaoxian increased the power of the flame, the feeling became clearer. There was no mistaking it. With such a strong repelling force, Xiaoxian's plan could not be carried out. It was no wonder that the people from Rock Hill City had not succeeded. Dead creatures could not resist. They had no consciousness and could not control their own bodies. However, this ancient corpse was actually repelling the power of Yanjiao's fire seed. How was this possible? However, everything in front of him was real. Unless, this ancient corpse was actually alive. However, it did not have any signs of life. This confused Xiaoxian because he could not explain it. Xiaoxian retracted his hand and thought for a moment. After a while, Xiaoxian raised his hand again. This time, he used another type of power in his body. He did not use the power of Yanjiao's fire seed. The uniqueness of this ancient corpse was that even though it was dead, the reaction of its bones was similar to that of a living person. The reason why living people were not suitable for this type of controlled enslavement was because of the repelling force of the main body. Not to mention the wanderer slaves, when the other tribesmen were alive, they had the power of the fire seed in their bodies. Even tribesmen who did not merge with the fire seed had the power of totems in their bodies. Totems were another form of the fire seed's power. Totems originated from the fire seed. The fire seed's repelling force would cause it to repel the power of other tribes' fire seeds. This was why Xiaoxian encountered resistance every time he tried to make a move. Therefore, Xiaoxian decided to withdraw the power of Yanjiao's fire seed and use another type of power in his body to try. The reason why Xiaoxian was not strongly repelled by the other tribe's fire seeds was because of this power. This time, a white flame appeared in Xiaoxian's hand, and he pressed his hand down. As Xiaoxian's hand approached, the white flame began to extend downwards, seeping into the ancient corpse's dark, dry skin and flesh. He didn't encounter any obstacles like the previous one, which was like going against the wind. Xiaoxian's heart calmed down a little. It seemed that he had made the right choice. The flame that seeped into the skin and flesh continued to seep in, touching the ancient corpse's bones. Then, the strong repelling force disappeared, as if a solid shield had been removed. It was unimpeded. The high activity of the ancient corpse's bones allowed them to quickly absorb the power of the flame that seeped in. Xiaoxian used his special vision to check. Just like the pterosaur, the ancient corpse's bones seemed to have been dyed white by the flame that seeped into it. However, there was no blood flow. The white color only existed in the bones and did not seep into the blood vessels and meridians. This was different from the pterosaur. That's right, an ancient corpse was not like the pterosaur. After all, it was a lifeless body. Naturally, there was no blood flow. The blood vessels and meridians were all damaged. The monsters controlled by Rock Hill City were the same. Did he succeed? Xiaoxian retracted his hand and extinguished the flame in his hand. Then, he used his mind. The ancient corpse on the stone table did not respond. Xiaoxian frowned. This was not right. Didn't he succeed just now? Why couldn't he control it? He tried a few more times, but the result was the same. He could affect the power that seeped into the bones, but he could not control the ancient corpse like he did the pterosaur. When Xiaoxian tried to control the pterosaur, he also used the same method on other dead beasts. According to his past experience, he should have succeeded by now, but he could not control it. After much effort, he finally managed to seep the power into the bones, but he could not control it. Xiaoxian still could not figure out the reason. He was troubled. Just as Xiaoxian was pondering the reason, Zheng Luo came down to call him. It was Gongjiaren. He wanted to ask about the forging of crystal gold. Gongjiaren and the rest had only come into contact with bronze wares. In fact, there were a small number of Gongjia family members who had come into contact with other types of metal wares. Naturally, they knew that there was more than one type of metal wares, but they had never come into contact with them before. That was why they were very interested in new types of metal wares. Before their own forging room was completed, they could not wait to interact with the Yanjiao craftsmen who had participated in the forging of crystal gold. They asked many questions in high spirits, but the Yanjiao craftsmen could not answer them. Gongjiaren could not resist the temptation. Coincidentally, Duo Kong had brought his hunting results from the headquarters to the trading point, so he followed along. Thinking about the Gongjia family's persistence, Xiaoxian thought about it and decided to explain everything to them. He would definitely stay here for a few more days because of the ancient corpse. This time, he had to explain everything to prevent Gongjiaren from coming over to ask again. He ordered the Yanjiao warriors to stand guard outside the secret chamber in case anything happened inside. Xiaoxian went to look for Gongjiaren first. The stone door closed. Other than the ancient corpse on the stone table, there was only the pterosaur huddled in the corner of the room. After Xiaoxian left, the pterosaur cautiously crawled towards the stone table from the corner. It was frightened by the flames on Xiaoxian's hand, but after Xiaoxian left, it became bolder and flew to the stone table to take a look at this strange person. Other than a similar aura to the pterosaur, there was nothing different about the ancient corpse from last night. Losing interest, the pterosaur glided down from the stone table and continued to eat the food it had not finished. As it chewed, the pterosaur suddenly paused, as if uncertain. Its body stiffened as it sensed carefully, then it quickly threw the food away and huddled in the corner again. It folded its wings and carefully peered at the stone table. Thin red lines appeared on the shriveled body of the ancient corpse on the stone table. They intersected like tree branches and gradually spread to every part of its body, growing denser and denser. Those were where the blood vessels and meridians were located. They were also carriers of energy. Xiaofan did not think this would happen, but now it did. The shriveled and stiff body emitted a faint crackling sound. If one looked closely, they would notice that the skin and flesh on the shriveled parts were changing. However, the changes were not drastic and were not obvious. The sunken parts of the ancient corpse's eyes moved, as if something was rolling underneath. The arms on both sides of the corpse trembled slightly, its fingers moving up and down. At first, it was only 1 or 2 fingers, but soon, the third, fifth and eventually the entire wrist was twisting. Whoosh! The ancient corpse suddenly sat up, scaring the pterosaur that was cowering in the corner. If Xiaofan was here, he would definitely be surprised. Not only because of the ancient corpse's behavior, but also because the person who sat up had no heartbeat. Chapter 756. On the stone table, the person who was sitting up twisted his neck, making a cracking sound. The dry and hard skin on his neck made his movements a little stiff, like a rusty machine. His movements were halting. The water moonstones were placed in the secret underground room. Perhaps it was because of the light, the person who sat up on the stone table turned his neck to look at the place where the water moonstones were placed. His sunken eyes moved and his eyelids opened bit by bit like a stuck window. It was like a beast that had been sleeping for a long time. The moment he opened his eyes, an invisible murderous aura and bloodthirsty aura surged out. His blood-red eyes stared straight ahead. The pterosaur in the corner didn't dare to make a sound. It tried its best to reduce its presence. It wanted to leave this place as far as possible, but other than the ventilation hole, there was no other place connected to the outside. And it couldn't crawl out of the ventilation hole. The person who sat up stared in the direction of the water moon stone. His red eyes moved, and then he twisted his neck and looked around. No emotion could be seen on his dry and hard face. Combined with this scene, it was quite a strange scene. Crack, 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 following the strange movements, the person who sat up turned around and got down from the stone table. When he stood on the ground, he seemed to be a little uncomfortable. His movements were very slow, and he even paused for a moment after he steadied himself. He looked at himself, and then looked around. His gaze stopped at some of the tools in the room, such as a water jar, a metal ware, and the cage in which the pterosaur slept. Finally, he retracted his gaze and lowered his head to look at what he was wearing. He raised his hand and picked up the necklace that he was wearing. The animal bones and stones on it were no longer the same as before. The changes were great. Some parts of the necklace were empty, and some parts were broken. He used his stiff fingers to pinch an irregularly shaped ornament on the necklace. His fingers exerted force, and with a cracking sound, the stone ornament was broken into pieces. Stone powder fell to the ground. The person looked at the stone fragments in his hand. No one knew what he was thinking, or he seemed to be in a daze. After a while, he raised his head and looked around again. The Yanjiao soldier standing guard outside the secret chamber didn't know what was going on inside, nor did he sense anything out of the ordinary. He only felt a chill run down his spine, and he couldn't help but shiver. Inside the secret chamber, the strange man's field of vision became wider after he stood up. He could see every corner of the secret chamber clearly. Finally, the strange man's eyes stopped on the pterosaur that was huddled in the corner. The pupils in those crimson eyes seemed to have widened as they stared straight at the pterosaur. The pterosaur's entire body was trembling. It had already sensed extreme danger. It also wanted to quickly dodge, but when that pair of eyes looked over, it felt as if a mountain was pressing down on it, making it difficult for it to move. Even the movement of moving its wings was difficult. As the strange man got closer, the pressure became more and more obvious. It was as if the pressure on its body was increasing. It could still move its wings earlier, but when the man walked in front of it, it felt as if it was frozen again. It could only tremble in despair. The man walked in front of the pterosaur, bent down, and stretched out his hand towards the pterosaur. No matter how hard the pterosaur shook its wings, it couldn't avoid being caught by this hand. Its folded wings and body were gripped by this large hand, and then it was lifted into the air. It wanted to struggle, but it couldn't loosen its grip at all. The skin and flesh of the shriveled fingers were pressed tightly against the bones, but the strength was immense. The pterosaur, who had already gained a lot of weight, felt as if it was going to vomit out the food it had just eaten. It felt the threat of death. In a moment of desperation, it broke free from the restraints of the strong pressure. No longer frozen, it bit down on the hand that was strangling it. The sharp teeth that could bite the piranhas in the flaming river into a bloody mess only left a shallow mark on this greenish-black hand. Perhaps the skin was broken, perhaps it wasn't. The dry and hard flesh had changed slightly compared to before, but it wasn't much. It was still very different from a normal person's skin. However, after being bitten by the pterosaur, this strange man didn't have any wounds on his hand. There was no blood. Other than the teeth marks, there was nothing else. It was as if the pterosaur hadn't bitten a human hand, but an abnormally hard piece of wood. The pterosaur panicked. This person's skin was very hard. That was fine, at least it could bite down. However, when its sharp teeth bit down, it felt as if it had touched a hard metal object. It couldn't go any deeper. Sensing that death was approaching, the pterosaur hurriedly bit down. Suddenly, a series of knocking sounds could be heard in the secret room. That was the sound of its teeth hitting the bones of the other party. However, the other party didn't seem to feel anything. He retracted his hand that was strangling the pterosaur, looked at it, and was about to put it into his mouth. Seeing that it was about to be eaten, the pterosaur finally screamed. It was very noisy. The skin on the strange man's brow bone was squeezed towards the middle. This was because his face was stiff. If it was a normal person, their brows would be tightly furrowed. He raised his other hand, planning to break the neck of the present in front of him first. Screech, the secret room's stone door opened. The commotion at the door made the strange man stop. He opened his mouth but didn't bite the pterosaur in his hand. Instead, he twisted his neck to look at the door. Xiaofan stood at the door. Behind him were Zheng Luo and the Yanjiao warrior who had been guarding here earlier. Xiaofan had been talking to Gongjiaren about crafting crystal gold when he suddenly sensed movement in the secret room. He immediately left Gongjiaren behind and rushed over here. Zheng Luo also realized that something might have happened to the strange man downstairs, so he followed him. When he saw the scene in the secret room, Zheng Luo couldn't help but suck in a deep breath. The person he thought had been dead for a long time was standing there, looking like he was going to eat the pterosaur raw. When the strange man heard the commotion and looked over, Zheng Luo felt like he was looking at the most ferocious beast in the forest. The air seemed to be dyed with an invisible stench of blood. The flaming horn warrior who was guarding the door gulped. He heard the commotion and wanted to open the stone door himself. Fortunately, the Grand Elder was here. Otherwise, he would have to face this person alone. This person looked very difficult to deal with. This should be considered a human, right? Zheng Luo wanted to ask Xiaofan if this was one of the strange men in the desert, but he quickly realized that this was different. Even if he had never seen a strange man in the desert, he had heard from others that those strange men had no consciousness of their own and were completely controlled by others. However, this strange man not far away clearly had his own consciousness. When he wasn't being controlled, he moved on his own and even knew how to hunt. When the pterosaur saw Xiaofan, it was as if it had seen the light in the darkness. Its cries became louder and more urgent. Xiaofan glanced at the pterosaur, then observed the shriveled, greenish-black monster. There was no breath, no heartbeat, but he moved like a living person. Moreover, Xiaofan could clearly feel the energy waves from this strange man. The energy that existed in this strange man's body was the energy that Xiaofan had injected into his body when he tried to control him. Everything was the same as the last time he controlled the enslavement. The only difference was the amount of energy used. However, the result was different. The biggest reason was probably because of the test subject. This man was strange. Zheng Luo took a step forward. The strange man's eyes became more alert and hostile. The red in his eyes deepened, as if a bloody battle was about to break out. Zheng Luo's eyes asked Xiaofan if he should make a move. Xiaofan shook his head slightly. He gestured with his hand, indicating that he should test the waters first. Xiaofan couldn't control this strange man like he did with the pterosaur. They didn't know anything about this strange man's temper or strength. If they made a move now, what if the strange man got agitated and strangled the pterosaur to death? Xiaofan still had a use for it. "Put it down," Xiaofan said. When the strange man looked at Xiaofan, the wariness in his eyes lessened. He was much calmer. However, he didn't seem to understand Xiaofan's words. His eyes were filled with confusion. If it wasn't for his dry skin, his expression would be much more expressive. Xiaofan looked at the strange man strangling the pterosaur, then met the strange man's eyes. He raised his hand and gestured for him to let go. He tried his best not to show any killing intent. He couldn't treat this strange man the same way he treated puppets without self-awareness. He chose to treat him the same way he treated other tribesmen. He wanted to negotiate. If negotiation didn't work, then he could only use brute force. The tribe wouldn't allow an uncontrollable threat to exist. As if understanding Xiaofan's intentions, the strange man let go of the pterosaur. The freed pterosaur scrambled towards Xiaofan. It was so nervous that it couldn't fly. It scuttled behind Xiaofan and stared at the strange man in the secret room. "Ka, ha," the strange man made some sounds. Perhaps it was because his vocal cords were damaged or because of other reasons, but the strange man's words sounded like meaningless syllables. However, there was no murderous intent in his eyes. Instead, he seemed a little anxious. Of course, this was only for Xiaofan. When he looked at Zheng Luo and the Yanjiao warrior, his red eyes were filled with wariness and an oppressive aura. "Is he hungry?" asked Zheng Luo. When Xiaofan opened the stone door, they saw the strange man already opening his cracked mouth at the pterosaur. He looked like he was about to eat it raw. Moreover, if a beast in the forest hadn't eaten for a long time, the first thing it would do after waking up would be to hunt for food. Xiaofan thought so too. When the pterosaur first woke up, it also ate a huge meal. Although he couldn't tell if this strange man was alive or dead, if he could eat the pterosaur, then he should be able to eat other animals. He turned his head and said a few words to the Yanjiao warrior who had been staring blankly inside. The warrior nodded and quickly left. The strange man was still making ka sounds at Xiaofan. Xiaofan couldn't understand what he was saying at all. He seemed to be having a hard time speaking too. The more he spoke, the more anxious he became. After taking a few steps towards the door, Zheng Luo's entire body tensed up. His hand went to the hilt of his sword at his waist. Xiaofan was also on guard, but he didn't feel any murderous intent from the strange man. That was why he didn't make a move. The strange man's movements were stiff. It was probably because he had been lying down for a long time. The warrior who had left quickly returned. He was carrying a freshly chopped beast leg. The blood was still dripping from the leg as he carried it over. Other than the beast leg, he also brought a plate of freshly cut cooked meat. The beast leg was brought over by Duo Kong. It was the leg of a large fearsome beast that had been hunted in the forest. When the Yanjiao warrior carried the beast leg over, it almost blocked the staircase. He had no choice. When he went to the butchering area, he saw the beast leg being cut off. Because he was in a hurry, he didn't think about anything else and just carried it over. After all, the great elder wanted it, so he carried a large one. When Xiaofan saw the large beast leg, he realized that he didn't make it clear. There was no need to bring such a large beast leg over. But since it was brought over, there was no need to say anything more. When Xiaofan took the two items, he exchanged glances with the warrior. The warrior nodded. Xiaofan knew that he had done what he said. He didn't just send the warrior out to take these things. He also told him to briefly explain the situation downstairs to Duo Kong. Duo Kong was now standing guard upstairs with his men. They didn't come down directly. That would make the atmosphere even worse. They were guarding the staircase exit. If the situation here was out of Xiaofan and Zheng Luo's control, the people upstairs could quickly come down to help. They could also block the exit. However, the strange man didn't seem to want to run out. When he saw the fearsome beast, his eyes were glued to the food. Not the plate of cooked meat, but the beast leg that was still dripping with blood. Xiaofan handed the plate of cooked meat to the warrior next to him. He held the beast leg with one hand and handed it to the strange man. His other hand hung down and rested on the hilt of his sword. The strange man didn't notice Xiaofan's movements. He only stared at the beast leg that Xiaofan handed over. He slowly walked over and reached out to take the beast leg. When he looked at Xiaofan, his face twitched. Perhaps he was smiling, but this smile was too creepy. His entire stiff face cracked. When he saw the strange man holding the beast leg, Xiaofan and the other two's hearts skipped a beat. This strange man was very strong. Fearsome beast meat and bones were much heavier than normal beasts. Normally, only Yanjiao people could easily carry such a large beast leg while running. However, the strange man held the beast leg just as easily. His arms were steady and his body didn't sway. Instead, he seemed to be studying the beast leg, turning it up and down to examine it. After looking at it, the strange man opened his mouth and bit down. Like a wild beast in the forest, he used brute force to rip the meat off. Blood splattered out, but the strange man didn't care. He continued to eat. After a few bites, he chewed casually and swallowed. Yanjiao people would eat raw food in the forest when it wasn't convenient to light a fire. However, this man was different. He looked even more barbaric. It was so quiet that only the sound of meat crunching could be heard. After eating for a while, the strange man looked at Zheng Luo and the Yanjiao soldiers behind him. Zheng Luo understood that look. It was the look of a wild beast protecting its food. If Zheng Luo took one step closer, they would immediately fight. The strange man's dry face was now covered in blood. When he looked at this face, the hairs on the back of Zheng Luo's neck stood on end. Crack crack crack, the strange sound rang again. This time, it came from all over the strange man's body. The dry and hard flesh on his body began to swell as if it had absorbed water. His biting and gnawing movements gradually became smoother. Suddenly, the strange man stopped biting the beast leg. He held the beast leg tightly with one hand and clutched his abdomen with the other, as if he was puzzled by something. Just as Xiaofan and the others were wondering what was going on, the strange man lowered his head and vomited. To Xiaofan's surprise, the strange man had indeed vomited beast meat. However, it looked like it had been dried in the sun. It was slightly white. Most of the blood and water had been sucked out. This was all that was left. When the bloody meat went into the man's stomach, what came out was dried white meat. The severely dehydrated meat had shrunk a lot. However, it seemed like the strange man had vomited everything he ate, except for blood and water. Xiaofan guessed that the strange man had been in this mummified state for too long. His digestive organs had changed. He could still use them, but they were different from normal people. His heart was still there. It was even functioning, but it wasn't beating. How strange. Xiaofan had never heard of a tribe like this. Where did the people from Rock Hill City find these people? After vomiting, the strange man stood there and stared at the thing he had vomited. No one knew what he was thinking. After a while, he continued to bite and eat. Just like that, he ate and vomited. Gradually, the huge beast leg was reduced to 2/3, half, 1/3, and finally, only bones were left. Xiaofan and the others were speechless. Holy shit, this was the first time they had seen someone who could eat more than the Yanjiao people. The strange man looked at the remaining leg bone in his hand. Then, he grabbed the beast leg bone with both hands. Because the leg bone was too thick, he couldn't grab it with his hands. Even so, the man held it firmly. With a cracking sound, the thick leg bone of the ferocious beast was broken. Xiaofan's eyelids twitched. This man had actually broken the beast leg bone like it was a sugarcane. Although the beast's bone was not one of the toughest beasts, it was still much tougher than other beasts. Although the flaming horns could also break a beast's bone, they couldn't do it as easily as this strange man. Zheng Luo and the other Yanjiao warrior weren't as calm as Xiaofan. Their eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. The Yanjiao people used to be called barbaric by other tribes, but this strange man in the secret room was much more barbaric than the Yanjiao people. After breaking the beast leg bone, the strange man began to suck on the bone marrow. If he wasn't satisfied with the fracture, he would break it again, or use two beast leg bones to knock against each other. The series of actions of breaking bones and extracting marrow seemed to be an instinct of his body. Everything was done very skillfully. Thinking back to his appearance and the accessories he wore, Xiaofan had a guess. This was an ancient person who had lived for an unknown period of time. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.